The winter air was thin and sharp over the Polish plains. The world had gone quiet, though the silence wasn't peace, it was aftermath. A set of railway tracks stretched endlessly into the horizon, cutting through frost and fog like an open wound. At their end stood a gate of iron and deceit, its words twisted into a promise that never was. Work sets you free. It was here that humanity confronted its own reflection and found something terrifying staring back. Auschwitz, just a word now, but once a world unto itself, a place designed not by chaos, but by calculation. Every beam, every nail, every timetable was part of a machinery that turned cruelty into order. Over 1 million people were swallowed by that machine. Fathers, mothers, children, entire lineages erased between the click of a typewriter key and the hiss of a gas valve. What began as persecution became production. What began as hatred became process. The horror was not hidden in the shadows it lived in. Plain sight. Engineers built blueprints. Doctors made measurements. Guards filled reports. Clerks stamped documents with steady hands, their pens gliding across the page, while the smoke of burning flesh rose just beyond the window. That is what makes Auschwitz unbearable. It wasn't hell in some mythic realm. It was built by men who went home to their families at night, who kissed their children goodnight, who believed they were simply doing a job. But even here, under the suffocating weight of despair, flickers of humanity refused to die. Prisoners whispered prayers in forbidden tongues. Some carved names into wooden bunks so they would not vanish without trace. Others traded bread for a moment of kindness, and in the heart of this living nightmare, defiance was born. In 1944, flames rose from Crematorium 4 as prisoners fought back against the impossible. They were crushed, yes, but for a brief heartbeat, the machinery of death trembled. When the Red Army arrived in January 1945, they did not find victory. They found ghosts that breathed. They found mountains of shoes, piles of hair, photographs scattered like snowflakes of lives once lived. Liberation came not as celebration, but as stunned silence. The gates stood open, but for those who walked out, freedom felt foreign. The world had changed forever, and so had humanity's understanding of itself. Today, the camp lies still beneath a gray sky. The rails are rusted, the watchtowers hollow, yet something remains in the air, a hum, a chill, a whisper that refuses to fade. It asks questions no century can fully answer. How could this happen? How close could we come to repeating it? And what does it mean to remember, not as a duty, but as survival of conscience? Tonight, we journey into that silence. We trace the rise of Auschwitz from its first foundations to its final ashes. We'll uncover the minds that built it, the lives that endured it, and the reckoning that followed. This is not a story of the past. It is a mirror held to our present, a warning written in smoke and memory. You are watching Lullaby of Empires, where history speaks, and silence remembers. The blueprint of evil, before the barbed wire, before the gas chambers, before the name Auschwitz became the synonym of human cruelty. There was a plan, an idea, born not in darkness but in the tidy offices of men who thought in ledgers and blueprints. Evil, here, did not begin with the crack of a whip. It began with paper, pen, and silence. In the late 1932, Europe was trembling on the edge of transformation. Hitler's Germany had already annexed Austria and the Sudetenland. The Nazi dream of a racially pure empire was no longer rhetoric. It was a logistical project, and like any project, it needed organization, space, labor, and a system. Poland, conquered within weeks of September 1939, became the perfect ground. At first, the small town of Auschwitz in southern Poland was unremarkable. Red brick houses, a railway junction, a river running gently through the fields. But those rails, that central location, that distance from Western Europe's watchful eyes, all of it made it ideal. In April 1940, Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, inspected the area. He saw not a town, but an opportunity. a site that could serve as both prison and experiment. His orders were clear: build a camp. It began modestly. 20 Polish political prisoners were sent to mark out the ground, reclaiming an old army barracks. The name was Germanized Auschwitz. The camp would hold about 10,000. It was not yet a death factory. It was a mechanism of control. But like all mechanisms, once built, it could be expanded. The first commandant was Rudolf Hess, a man of disturbing efficiency and calm demeanor. He was no frothing fanatic, he was a manager. Under his supervision, the camp grew in shape and purpose. Hess admired discipline, schedules, punctuality. He drew charts, memoranda, flow diagrams. He believed cruelty could be systematized. By the end of 1940, Auschwitz was complete rows of brick barracks, a double fence charged with electricity, watchtowers at perfect intervals. Prisoners slept on wooden planks in tiers, 3 high. Food was minimal, water scarce, and beatings constant. The motto, Arbeit macht frei, work sets you free, was welded onto the iron gate at the camp's entrance. It was a lie so audacious that it became emblematic of Nazi deceit itself. At first, most prisoners were Poles, intellectuals, priests, resistance members. Then came Soviet POWs. Soon, trains from across occupied Europe began to arrive. With each arrival, the camp evolved, its machinery becoming more efficient, more anonymous. Bureaucrats in Berlin sent requisitions, barbed wire by the kilometer, tons of cement, barrack roofs, and, later, Zyklon B canisters. Nothing about this was impulsive. Auschwitz was designed. It had drafts, budgets, engineers, architects, and project managers. The firm of Topf and Sona supplied the crematoria. IG Farben built a vast synthetic rubber factory nearby, drawing slave labor from the camp. The collaboration of private industry and ideology gave birth to something unprecedented: a modern economy of death. In a conference room in Berlin, officials spoke in euphemisms: special treatment, resettlement, final solution. Each phrase was a linguistic shield for murder. The world outside heard the words but not their meaning, and inside Auschwitz, meaning itself was being inverted. Doctors became executioners, scientists became torturers, guards became gods. By 1941, expansion began toward what would be called Birkenau Auschwitz II. This was no longer a prison, it was an engine, designed to hold 100,000. It sprawled across the fields like a steel-ribbed skeleton. Barracks rose in rows, roads and railways crisscrossed like veins. Underground chambers were constructed. Bathhouses, the blueprint said. But these baths had no plumbing. They were designed to deliver gas. Even the methods of killing were tested, optimized. When bullets proved too slow, starvation too visible, carbon monoxide too cumbersome, the SS sought something cleaner, efficient, silent, industrial. Zyklon B, a pesticide, became their tool. In September 1941, in a sealed basement of Block 11, several hundred Soviet prisoners were exposed to it. They died within minutes. The experiment was deemed successful. The machinery was ready. Still, outside the camp, the town continued to function. Locals saw smoke rising, heard distant gunfire, watched endless trains. Some averted their eyes, some profited. A few risked everything to smuggle food or information. Evil, as history would learn, requires not only perpetrators but bystanders. Hus and his officers kept meticulous records: transports, selections, rations, deaths. The daily report became an opposite start, instrument of genocide. And yet, within those same barracks, amid the brutality, tiny acts of humanity survived. Prisoners whispered prayers, taught each other songs, scrawled names on walls with pieces of brick. One wrote, "If anyone lives, tell what happened here." Meanwhile, in Berlin, planners refined timetables. In January 1942, at the Wannsee Conference, the final solution became formal policy. The extermination of Europe's Jews was to proceed systematically, and Auschwitz would be its central hub. It was chosen for its location, its capacity, and its commanders' proven efficiency. The blueprints multiplied. Engineers proposed faster crematoria. Railway officials designed schedules that synchronized deportations across the continent. Accountants calculated costs per head, per kilometer. The precision was chilling. Murder had become mathematics. When the new gas chambers and crematoria were completed in 1943, they could kill and burn thousands each day. The ashes were dumped into ponds, fields, or used to fertilize crops. Even death had utility. From the sky, the camp looked like order rectangles of barracks, straight lines of rails, guard towers casting symmetrical shadows. But from the ground, it was madness made material. The landscape itself seemed to absorb suffering. Trees withered near the chimneys, snow turned gray before it settled. The wind carried whispers that no one could unhear. Every part of Auschwitz had purpose. The entrance gate managed arrivals. The sorting area divided the doomed from the spared. The warehouses stored stolen belongings labeled, inventoried, catalogued. There was a room for shoes, another for spectacles, another for hair. Efficiency demanded separation. Even the remains of people were processed, bone ash for fertilizer, gold fillings melted for currency. Nothing was wasted. And yet the machine depended on obedience. The commandant's office demanded punctuality, not passion. Guards filled out time cards, attended roll call, wrote reports. The horror was not in their frenzy, but in their calm. That calm, that administrative detachment, is what gives this chapter its name, the blueprint of evil. Evil here was not rage, it was reason without conscience. It wore a uniform pressed and clean. It spoke politely. It followed orders, filed paperwork, built barracks, and drew maps. It was banal, efficient, and devastating. By the spring of 1943, Auschwitz had become the largest cemetery without graves in human history. But its creators saw it as progress, a model. When inspectors visited, Huss guided them proudly, explaining procedures with professional detachment. The irony is unbearable. The more organized the camp became, the further it drifted from humanity itself. Still, beyond those walls, the world remained half asleep. Rumors reached London and Washington, reports from escapees, coded letters, fragments of testimony but disbelief, and war priorities buried them. The machinery kept running, trains kept arriving, smoke kept rising. The blueprint of evil was complete. It was drawn not only on paper, but in the minds of those who thought themselves civilized, and long after the architects were gone, their design would remain etched into the soil of southern Poland, silent, cold, and waiting for us to look. Auschwitz rises. When the first frost of 1940 settled over southern Poland, the foundations of Auschwitz were already being laid. Not only the physical foundations of barracks and fences, but the moral foundation of something new, a world that had learned to kill by design. Evil had found its architects, and the blueprints were now coming to life. The SS engineers arrived early that spring. They wore clean uniforms and carried clipboards, not weapons. To them, the task was practical: transform a cluster of Polish army buildings into a protective custody camp. There was no talk of murder, not yet. The vocabulary was sterile, the plans efficient. They built roads, watchtowers, drainage ditches. They expanded the railway siding to accommodate incoming trains. On paper, it looked like progress. But beneath the paperwork, a transformation was taking place that would change history. Every wall raised, every brick laid, was a step towards something unimaginable: the industrialization of death. Rudolf Hess, the camp's commandant, was at the center of it all. A man of quiet manners and chilling detachment, he approached his task with what he considered professional excellence. He spoke often of discipline and order. To him, Auschwitz was not chaos. It was an organism that had to function smoothly. Later, at his trial, he would say with pride that he had made the camp a model of efficiency. Hess oversaw everything: construction schedules, guard rotations, prisoner work details, and food distribution. He ensured that the camp ran on time. He expected his men to follow regulations precisely. He banned unnecessary violence, not out of mercy, but because it was unproductive. In this cold logic lay the horror of Auschwitz, a place where evil wore the face of procedure. By mid-1941, expansion was underway. Himmler had visited and was pleased. He wanted more space, more capacity, more order. The new camp, Birkenau Auschwitz II, would be built a few kilometers away. It would dwarf the original complex, stretching across fields that once grew wheat and poppies. The construction crews were prisoners themselves. They labored from dawn until nightfall, hauling stones, digging trenches, collapsing from exhaustion. The SS guards drove them relentlessly. Those who fell behind were beaten, sometimes shot. Their bodies were buried beneath the very foundations they built. In time, the soil of Auschwitz would contain not only bones, but layers of its own history. The buried proof of every order followed without question. Hess reported each month to Berlin. His tone was matter-of-fact. Housing for 20,000 prisoners completed. Additional electrified fences installed. Crematorium construction approved. He used no adjectives, no emotion. The machinery of administration had already begun to hum. Meanwhile, trains from across occupied Europe began to roll in more frequently. The deportations were still selective. Polish intellectuals, Soviet POWs, political prisoners, Jews from the ghettos of Krakow and Tarnów were among the first, forced onto cattle cars with the promise of resettlement. When they arrived, they found not new homes, but fences, dogs, and gunfire. For the local villagers of Auschwitz, the transformation was bewildering. A quiet town had become a fortress. Barbed wire now glinted in the morning sun, and the air carried strange smells, burning coal at first. Then something else. Farmers whispered that they saw columns of prisoners marching barefoot along the roads, flanked by soldiers. The town's silence became its complicity. As Birkenau rose, so too did the precision of the operation. Engineers from Berlin arrived with charts and measuring tools. They debated drainage and ventilation, argued over the angle of chimneys, the capacity of furnaces. Every detail mattered. Auschwitz was to be efficient, self-sustaining, capable of processing thousands each day without interruption. The SS called it optimization. History would call it genocide. By 1942, the scale of the camp had surpassed imagination. Dozens of wooden barracks stretched in neat rows, surrounded by electrified fences. New rail spurs connected directly to the ramp where prisoners would soon be unloaded. Water towers rose beside fields of mud. In the commandant's office, typewriters clacked steadily, each letter a record of someone's fate. The guards came from all corners of the Reich clerks, farmers, school teachers, men who once lived ordinary lives. Many had never killed before, yet here, under orders, surrounded by uniforms and ideology, they became cogs in something far larger than themselves. Evil had ceased to look like rage. It now looked like routine. The daily rhythm of the camp became mechanical. At dawn, a siren. At night, a roll call. Prisoners marched in rows through the mud, emaciated bodies carrying heavy stones or wheelbarrows. The SS watched from towers, rifles across their shoulders, smoking cigarettes. For every 10 prisoners who collapsed, another 100 arrived. When the weather warmed, the stench intensified. The first experimental gas chambers, converted from old farmhouses, were operational. The victims were told they would shower. They entered calmly, still holding the illusion of survival. Minutes later, silence. It was in these months that Auschwitz crossed a threshold from a site of punishment to a site of annihilation. The logic shifted. The goal was no longer control. It was erasure. And yet, within those barbed walls, life continued in strange and fragile ways. Prisoners found ways to help each other, smuggling scraps of bread, sharing stolen potatoes, whispering prayers under blankets. Some wrote fragments of poetry, scratched names onto planks, or hid letters beneath floorboards. Hope was a kind of rebellion. Even a smile could be an act of resistance. For women, the camp was especially brutal. They were forced into overcrowded barracks with no sanitation, no privacy. Many were used in medical experiments, sterilizations, injections, mutilations carried out under the pretext of science. For the SS doctors, these experiments were research. For the victims, they were unspeakable torment. Children arrived too, some with mothers, others alone. The youngest were sent straight to the gas chambers. Those who looked older were used for labor or experiments. Twins were separated and studied. Their suffering became data points in notebooks that still exist today. By 1943, the killing had reached its height. The gas chambers were operating daily, the crematoria belching black smoke across the horizon. The SS timed the process, perfected it, measured efficiency. A single transport could be processed in less than 2 hours. Bureaucracy had achieved its darkest perfection. Yet even amid this horror, the machinery began to strain. The crematoria could not keep up with the influx of bodies. Ashes piled high. Some were dumped into rivers, others scattered into fields. The soil turned gray. Birds no longer sang near the camp. Outside, the war was turning. The Germans were losing in Russia. Allied bombers darkened the skies over Europe. But at Auschwitz, the rhythm continued, indifferent to victory or defeat. As long as the trains arrived, the furnaces burned. Rudolf Höss was briefly transferred to Berlin, replaced by other commandants. The system remained intact. The men who took over, Arthur Liebehenschel, then Richard Baer, followed the same routines, the same paperwork. Individual names no longer mattered. Auschwitz had become self-sustaining, like a machine that had learned to feed itself. Even the surrounding economy thrived on it. German companies profited from slave labor. Uniforms were sewn by prisoners. Weapons were assembled under guard. The same hands that dug ditches by day were forced to build the tools of their own oppression. And still, despite everything, some prisoners dreamed. They dreamed of survival, of revenge, of telling the story. A few risked everything to escape. A handful succeeded. Their reports smuggled to the outside world described gas chambers, crematoria, and mass killings in detail. But disbelief was powerful. Exaggeration, some said. Impossible, others insisted. Humanity's imagination had not yet caught up to its cruelty. By late 1944, the tide of war reached even Auschwitz. The SS began dismantling evidence, blowing up crematoria, burning documents. But the ground itself refused to forget. The bones, the ashes, the traces of 1 million lives remained. The camp, once a construction project, had become a graveyard too vast for maps. When Soviet troops finally approached in January 1945, what they found was not an army, but ruins, the skeletal remains of buildings, and the skeletal remains of people. The SS had fled, leaving behind thousands too weak to move. In the stillness that followed, the enormity of what had risen there began to unfold. The barbed wire hummed in the winter wind. The chimneys stood black against the sky. The ground was frozen, but beneath it lay layers of ash, the physical sediment of genocide. It is said that when the soldiers entered, some wept, others fell silent. They had seen battle, but nothing like this. Nothing that revealed so plainly how evil could be constructed not in rage, but in order, not in chaos, but in precision. The story of Auschwitz's rise is not only about architecture or ideology, it is about what happens when conscience yields to convenience, when morality becomes a line item in a budget. It is about how ordinary men, trained to obey, can build extraordinary horror and call it duty. In the years that followed, those blueprints were found. Pages of measurements, signatures, stamps, lines drawn by human hands. The rooms they outlined still exist. Visitors today walk their corridors slowly, touching the cold brick, hearing their footsteps echo against the past. The buildings are silent now, but in their silence lives a question that history can never stop asking. How could this have been built? And somewhere, in that silence, the answer whispers back that Auschwitz did not rise from monsters. It rose from men, from engineers, accountants, doctors, and soldiers who believed they were serving order, not evil. That is what makes this story terrifying. That is what makes it essential to remember. The machinery of death. By 1942, Auschwitz had become more than a camp. It had become a system, a cold, rhythmic machine, humming with precision. Its gears were made of men, its oil was blood, and its purpose was nothing less than the erasure of an entire people. The process was not improvised. It was organized, refined, and perfected. From the moment a prisoner's name appeared on a transport list to the moment their ashes were scattered into the river, every step was documented, timed, and accounted for. No single act stood alone. It belonged to a chain of command that linked secretaries, engineers, guards, and generals. The camp commandant, Rudolf Höss, once described the operation as a complex logistical challenge. His words were clinical, almost proud. He spoke of throughput, capacity, maintenance. These were not the words of hatred, they were the words of management. That is what made Auschwitz so terrifying. It was not built by rage, but by reason. At the top were the planners Himmler, Pohl, Kammler bureaucrats in uniforms who understood that to annihilate millions, they would need infrastructure. Orders were typed, stamped, and distributed. Construction plans were reviewed, costs calculated, schedules enforced. Beneath them worked the SS engineers and architects, including men from the Topf and Sune company who designed the crematoria ovens. They debated the technicalities of killing. Could more bodies be burned per hour? Could airflow be improved? Could gas distribution be made faster? These were the conversations of civilized men made monstrous by purpose. The heart of the machinery was the railway. Without it, Auschwitz would have remained a prison. With it, it became a gateway to extinction. Trains arrived daily from across occupied Europe, from France, Hungary, the Netherlands, Greece, Italy, and Germany itself. They carried human cargo packed so tightly that people could not sit. The journey lasted days. There was no food, no water, no air. Children cried until they could no longer cry. By the time the trains reached the ramp, many were already dead. SS officers stood waiting, clipboards in hand. Dogs barked. Guards shouted orders. The deportees stumbled out, blinking against the light, clutching whatever they had managed to bring: a suitcase, a photograph, a loaf of bread wrapped in paper. Then came the selection. It lasted minutes, but decided everything. To one side, the young, the healthy, those deemed fit for work. To the other, the elderly, the sick, the pregnant, the children. There were no explanations, no goodbyes. The line moved quickly. Those selected for labor were marched toward registration and barracks. The rest were told they were going for a shower. This was the machinery's first deception, its most essential lie. The victims walked calmly because they still believed there was order, that the uniforms and the gates and the barking dogs were temporary obstacles in an organized world. They were led to changing rooms, long, low buildings with wooden benches. Signs instructed them to hang their clothes neatly, to remember their hook numbers. The illusion of normality persisted to the end. Mothers soothed crying children. Old men adjusted their hats. Some whispered prayers. Then, through another door, the chamber. Heavy steel doors closed behind them. The lights dimmed. Guards climbed to the roof, dropped pellets of Zyklon B through openings. The gas hissed softly as it reacted to the air. For a moment, there was confusion, coughing, shouting, then nothing but the scraping of fingernails against concrete. It took 20 minutes for silence to fall. When the doors opened, the bodies were tangled together, parents clutching children, hands reaching for air. Prisoners of the Sonderkommando, themselves condemned to die in time, dragged the corpses out, shaved their hair, pulled gold from their teeth, and carried them to the furnaces. The cycle began again. This was not chaos. It was choreography. Each crematorium had multiple ovens, capable of burning thousands of bodies per day. The ashes were ground, the remains scattered into ponds, rivers, or spread over fields. At times, when capacity was exceeded, bodies were burned in open pits. The flames lit the night sky, and the smoke carried the smell of death for miles. For the men who ran it, this was routine. Hess himself later wrote, "The killing was easy once the system was established." He kept logs, counted deliveries of Zyklon B, monitored output. His reports to Berlin were precise. Transport from Holland, 2,800. Processed. Efficiency, satisfactory. The word processed, that was how they spoke of it. And around this killing core, the rest of the camp functioned like a city. There were offices, workshops, stables, a post exchange, even a brothel for SS men. There were schedules, salaries, promotions, holidays. The SS officers wrote letters home about their families, their gardens, their children's birthdays. One complained about the noise of the crematoria. Another asked for a piano to be sent from Berlin. In the evenings, they dined together, drank, played cards. The same men who supervised mass murder by day laughed over wine by night. Outside their walls, the machinery continued to feed. The trains did not stop. To the prisoners inside, life was reduced to a system of numbers and hunger. Each day began with roll call, stretching for hours in the freezing cold or blistering heat. Thousands stood motionless as SS men counted and recounted. The weak collapsed. The dead were dragged away. Then came the labor, hauling stones, digging ditches, carrying heavy beams, cleaning latrines. Work was punishment, but also a means of selection. Those too weak to keep up were sent to the gas chambers. There was no retirement, only replacement. Inside the barracks, disease spread. Lice and typhus were constant. The air stank of sweat, rot, and despair. Prisoners stole crumbs, shared rags, traded for a sip of soup. Hope was dangerous, it made you careless. But hopelessness killed faster. And yet, through this relentless cruelty, fragments of humanity persisted. Prisoners whispered names at night to keep them from disappearing. Some secretly prayed. Some sang lullabies to the dying. Others drew sketches on scraps of paper, hiding them under floorboards, hoping that someday someone would find them. Auschwitz's efficiency depended on these quiet obediences, people doing what they were told, believing there was no choice. Even the trains that brought victims were operated by ordinary railway workers. Tickets were printed, schedules stamped, meals served in dining cars for the SS. The machinery of death reached far beyond the fences. It extended into every office and every station where indifference lived. For those inside, time lost meaning, days blurred into months. Some survived by detaching their minds, by pretending the world outside no longer existed. Others survived through defiance, tiny, invisible acts. A stolen potato, a whispered prayer, a child hidden for one more day. But the system was total. The machinery allowed no pause, no mercy. It consumed everything: bodies, souls, silence. Even nature seemed to recoil. Birds stopped nesting near the camp. The river Sola, once clear, turned gray with ash. The ground itself grew heavy, as if burdened by what it had absorbed. And still, in Berlin, officials congratulated themselves. Reports from Auschwitz were marked satisfactory. Production quotas were met. Everything ran on schedule. The machinery of death was working perfectly. Yet, it is in perfection that it began to crumble. For perfection in killing requires perfection in secrecy, and secrecy cannot last forever. By late 1943, whispers had begun to spread. A few prisoners escaped. They carried with them documents, sketches of gas chambers, coded notes. The world outside began to learn. A Polish underground courier, Witold Pilecki, had infiltrated Auschwitz itself, gathered intelligence, and escaped after nearly 3 years. His reports reached London. They were so horrific that even Allied officials doubted them. Still, they were true, every word. Within the camp, the machinery continued, but cracks appeared. Corruption among guards, theft, fatigue, drunkenness. The SS began to sense what was coming, the war turning, the inevitable end. But the killing did not stop, it accelerated. In the summer of 1944, After the German occupation of Hungary, nearly 500,000 Hungarian Jews were deported to Auschwitz in less than 8 weeks. The machinery strained under the load. Crematoria ran day and night. Fields were set ablaze with bodies. Trains lined up for kilometers. This was the machine at its most efficient and its most insane. Hess was recalled temporarily to oversee the process. He boasted later that they had achieved record processing. But his pride could not disguise the truth. The machinery of death had devoured itself. By autumn, the Red Army was approaching. Panic spread through the SS ranks. Orders came to destroy evidence, burn documents, dismantle furnaces, evacuate prisoners. The system that had prided itself on order collapsed into chaos. In those final months, the machinery made one last desperate effort: the death marches. Tens of thousands of prisoners were forced to walk westward in freezing temperatures, barefoot, starving, collapsing in snow. Those who fell were shot. Few reached their destinations. When Soviet troops entered Auschwitz on the 27th of January 1945, they found the remnants of the machine: silent rails, broken ovens, rooms full of shoes, hair, and glasses. They found 7,000 survivors' skeletons wrapped in skin, too weak to move. The machinery of death had stopped, but its echo would never fade. In the years that followed, investigators found the blueprints, the orders, the invoices. They found the names of companies that supplied materials, of engineers who designed furnaces, of guards who filled out forms. They discovered that the machinery was not built by monsters alone. It was built by ordinary hands, by people who believed they were merely doing their work. That, perhaps, is the most terrible truth. The horror of Auschwitz was not that it was chaotic, but that it was organized. Not that it was hidden, but that it was normalized. The killing had been made routine, turned into an occupation, an industry. When the survivors spoke years later, they often used the same word: machine. They said it felt like being inside a machine, one that turned people into numbers, numbers into ashes, and ashes into dust. And in a way, they were right. Auschwitz was not simply a place of death. It was a system of thought, a vision of what happens when efficiency replaces empathy, when obedience replaces conscience, when human beings become mere entries in a ledger. The machinery of death began with an idea, but it ended with silence. The kind of silence that falls when the engine stops, and the world finally hears what it has done. The machinery of death. By 1942, Auschwitz had become more than a camp. It had become a system, a cold, rhythmic machine, humming with precision. Its gears were made of men, its oil was blood, and its purpose was nothing less than the erasure of an entire people. The process was not improvised. It was organized, refined, and perfected. From the moment a prisoner's name appeared on a transport list to the moment their ashes were scattered into the river, every step was documented, timed, and accounted for. No single act stood alone. It belonged to a chain of command that linked secretaries, engineers, guards, and generals. The camp commandant, Rudolf Höss, once described the operation as a complex logistical challenge. His words were clinical, almost proud. He spoke of throughput, capacity, maintenance. These were not the words of hatred, they were the words of management. That is what made Auschwitz so terrifying. It was not built by rage, but by reason. At the top were the planners: Himmler, Pohl, Kammler, bureaucrats in uniforms who understood that to annihilate millions, they would need infrastructure. Orders were typed, stamped, and distributed. Construction plans were reviewed, costs calculated, schedules enforced. Beneath them worked the SS engineers and architects, including men from the Topf-Sony company who designed the crematoria ovens. They debated the technicalities of killing. Could more bodies be burned per hour? Could airflow be improved? Could gas distribution be made faster? These were the conversations of civilized men, made monstrous by purpose. The heart of the machinery was the railway. Without it, Auschwitz would have remained a prison. With it, it became a gateway to extinction. Trains arrived daily from across occupied, Europe from France, Hungary, the Netherlands, Greece, Italy, and Germany itself. They carried human cargo packed so tightly that people could not sit. The journey lasted days. There was no food, no water, no air. Children cried until they could no longer cry. By the time the trains reached the ramp, many were already dead. SS officers stood waiting, clipboards in hand. Dogs barked, guards shouted orders. The deportees stumbled out, blinking against the light, clutching whatever they had managed to bring: a suitcase, a photograph, a loaf of bread wrapped in paper. Then came the selection. It lasted minutes, but decided everything. To one side, the young, the healthy, those deemed fit for work. To the other, the elderly, the sick, the pregnant, the children. There were no explanations, no goodbyes. The line moved quickly. Those selected for labor were marched toward registration and barracks. The rest were told they were going for a shower. This was the Registerung, machinery's first deception, its most essential lie. The victims walked calmly because they still believed there was order, that the uniforms and the gates and the barking dogs were temporary obstacles in an organized world. They were led to changing rooms, long, low buildings with wooden benches. Signs instructed them to hang their clothes neatly, to remember their hook numbers. The illusion of normality persisted to the end. Mothers soothed crying children, old men adjusted their hats, some whispered prayers. Then, through another door, the chamber. Heavy steel doors closed behind them, the lights dimmed. Guards climbed to the roof, dropped pellets of Zyklon B through openings. The gas hissed softly as it reacted to the air. For a moment, there was confusion, coughing, shouting, then nothing but the scraping of fingernails against concrete. It took 20 minutes for silence to fall. When the doors opened, the bodies were tangled together, parents clutching, children, hands reaching for air. Prisoners of the Sonderkommando, themselves condemned to die in time, dragged the corpses out, shaved their hair, pulled gold from their teeth, and carried them to the furnaces. The cycle began again. This was not chaos. It was choreography. Each crematorium had multiple ovens, capable of burning thousands of bodies per day. The ashes were ground, the remains scattered into ponds, rivers, or spread over fields. At times, when capacity was exceeded, bodies were burned in open pits. The flames lit the night sky, and the smoke carried the smell of death for miles. For the men who ran it, this was routine. Hess himself later wrote, "The killing was easy once the system was established." He kept logs, counted deliveries of Zyklon B, monitored output. His reports to Berlin were precise. Transport from Holland, 2,800. Processed. Efficiency satisfactory. The word processed, that was how they spoke of it. And around this killing core, the rest of the camp functioned like a city. There were offices, workshops, stables, a post exchange, even a brothel for SS men. There were schedules, salaries, promotions, holidays. The SS officers wrote letters home about their families, their gardens, their children's birthdays. One complained about the noise of the crematoria. Another asked for a piano to be sent from Berlin. In the evenings they dined together, drank, played cards. The same men who supervised mass murder by day laughed over wine by night. Outside their walls, the machinery continued to feed. The trains did not stop. To the prisoners inside, life was reduced to a system of numbers and hunger. Each day began with roll call, stretching for hours in the freezing cold or blistering heat. Thousands stood motionless as SS men counted and recounted. The weak collapsed. The dead were dragged away. Then came the labor hauling stones, digging ditches, carrying heavy beams, cleaning latrines. Work was punishment, but also a means of selection. Those too weak to keep up were sent to the gas chambers. There was no retirement, only replacement. Inside the barracks, disease spread. Lice and typhus were constant. The air stank of sweat, rot, and despair. Prisoners stole crumbs, shared rags, traded for a sip of soup. Hope was dangerous, it made you careless. But hopelessness killed faster. And yet, through this relentless cruelty, fragments of humanity persisted. Prisoners whispered names at night to keep them from disappearing. Some secretly prayed. Some sang lullabies to the dying. Others drew sketches on scraps of paper, hiding them under floorboards, hoping that someday someone would find them. Auschwitz's efficiency depended on these quiet obediences, people doing what they were told, believing there was no choice. Even the trains that brought victims were operated by ordinary railway workers. Tickets were printed, schedules stamped, meals served in dining cars for the SS. The machinery of death reached far beyond the fences. It extended into every office and every station where indifference lived. For those inside, time lost meaning. Days blurred into months. Some survived by detaching their minds, by pretending the world outside no longer existed. Others survived through defiance, tiny, invisible acts, a stolen potato, a whispered prayer, a child hidden for one more day. But the system was total. The machinery allowed no pause, no mercy. It consumed everything: bodies, souls, silence. Even nature seemed to recoil. Birds stopped nesting near the camp. The river Sola, once clear, turned gray with ash. The ground itself grew heavy, as if burdened by what it had absorbed. And still, in Berlin, officials congratulated themselves. Reports from Auschwitz were marked satisfactory. Production quotas were met. Everything ran on schedule. The machinery of death was working perfectly. Yet, it is in perfection that it began to crumble. For perfection in killing requires perfection in secrecy, and secrecy cannot last forever. By late 1943, whispers had begun to spread. A few prisoners escaped. They carried with them documents, sketches of gas chambers, coded notes. The world outside began to learn. A Polish underground courier, Witold Pilecki, had infiltrated Auschwitz itself, gathered intelligence, and escaped after nearly 3 years. His reports reached London. They were so horrific that even Allied officials doubted them. Still, they were true. Every word. Within the camp, the machinery continued, but cracks appeared. Corruption among guards, theft, fatigue, drunkenness. The SS began to sense what was coming. The war turning, the inevitable end. But the killing did not stop. It accelerated. In the summer of 1944, after the German occupation of Hungary, nearly 500,000 Hungarian Jews were deported to Auschwitz in less than 8 weeks. The machinery strained under the load. Crematoria ran day and night. Fields were set ablaze with bodies. Trains lined up for kilometers. This was the machine at its most efficient and its most insane. Hess was recalled temporarily to oversee the process. He boasted later that they had achieved record processing. But his pride could not disguise the truth. The machinery of death had devoured itself. By autumn, the Red Army was approaching. Panic spread through the SS ranks. Orders came to destroy evidence, burn documents, dismantle furnaces, evacuate prisoners. The system that had prided itself on order collapsed into chaos. In those final months, the machinery made one last desperate effort: the death marches. Tens of thousands of prisoners were forced to walk westward in freezing temperatures, barefoot, starving, collapsing in snow. Those who fell were shot. Few reached their destinations. When Soviet troops entered Auschwitz on the 27th of January 1945, they found the remnants of the machine: silent rails, broken ovens, rooms full of shoes, hair, and glasses. They found 7,000 survivors' skeletons wrapped in skin, too weak to move. The machinery of death had stopped, but its echo would never fade. In the years that followed, investigators found the blueprints, the orders, the invoices. They found the names of companies that supplied materials, of engineers who designed furnaces, of guards who filled out forms. They discovered that the machinery was not built by monsters alone. It was built by ordinary hands, by people who believed they were merely doing their work. That, perhaps, is the most terrible truth. The horror of Auschwitz was not that it was chaotic, but that it was organized. Not that it was hidden, but that it was normalized. The killing had been made routine, turned into an occupation, an industry. When the survivors spoke years later, they often used the same word, machine. They said it felt like being inside a machine, one that turned people into numbers, numbers into ashes, and ashes into dust. And in a way, they were right. Auschwitz was not simply a place of death. It was a system of thought, a vision of what happens when efficiency replaces empathy, when obedience replaces conscience, when human beings become mere entries in a ledger. The machinery of death began with an idea, but it ended with silence. The kind of silence that falls when the engine stops, and the world finally hears what it has done. Arrival at the gate. By the summer of 1942, Auschwitz had learned to hide its purpose in plain sight. The fences stood tall, the wires hummed quietly, and the gate bore its cruel greeting, Arbeit macht frei. Work makes you free. The words were neat, almost elegant, wrought in iron by a blacksmith prisoner who did not yet know that no one who walked beneath them would find freedom at all. From a distance, it looked like a camp, not a killing center. There were barracks, watchtowers, chimneys, workshops. Smoke drifted gently into the sky, and the rhythmic whistle of trains echoed across the flat Polish countryside. It could almost have been mistaken for a factory, and in a way, that was exactly what it was, a factory that produced nothing but silence. Each new transport arrived with the same routine precision. The gates opened, the guards shouted, and the cattle cars slid forward along the steel tracks with a metallic groan. Inside, there was no space to move. Dozens were pressed together in suffocating darkness. Children whimpered. Mothers tried to quiet them with dry lips. Old men stood because there was nowhere to sit. The smell was unbearable: sweat, fear, and the slow rot of breathless bodies. When the train finally stopped, the doors burst open. Fresh air flooded in, sharp and cold. It was not relief, it was confusion. Guards barked orders in German. Dogs lunged and growled. Prisoners in striped uniforms, the Sonderkommando, began unloading the dead first, those who had suffocated or been crushed in the journey. The others were herded out, blinking, disoriented, clutching their few remaining belongings. The Ramp die Rampe was where life and death diverged. SS officers stood at attention, clipboards in hand, each movement rehearsed, efficient. Among them, the camp doctor's men, like Joseph Mengele and Fritz Klein, watched with a calm that seemed almost casual. A flick of the wrist decided a destiny. Left, right, work, death. There was no time for explanation. Families were separated in seconds. Mothers instinctively tried to hold on to their children. Husbands reached for wives. The guards shouted louder. The dogs barked closer. A soldier tore a child away. Another struck an old man who stumbled. And in the confusion, the human voice, the cries, the prayers, the questions melted into the mechanical hum of the operation. Those sent to the right were marched away toward the barracks. They would be registered, tattooed, and assigned numbers. Those sent to the left were told they were going to be disinfected. Many believed it. After all, they had survived the war this far. Surely this was another inconvenience, another temporary measure. They had no idea that the word disinfection was the final lie they would ever hear. For the SS, this was the arrival routine, what they called processing. Every gesture had a purpose. Belongings were sorted, luggage was tagged, documents were collected. The orchestration was flawless. Even deception required discipline. On some days, the ramp resembled a market square. Piles of suitcases grew beside mountains of shoes, spectacles, and children's toys. The sound of trains never stopped, one leaving empty, another arriving full. The machinery of death had no pause. Among the new arrivals, disbelief was common. Many still wore their best clothes. Some carried musical instruments, typewriters, wedding photographs. They had been told they were being resettled. Some believed they were going to work in German factories. Even when they saw smoke rising from the chimneys, few could grasp what it meant. Human beings are built to hope, even when hope defies logic. The SS exploited that instinct mercilessly. As the selections continued, the sun climbed higher. Guards shouted names they never intended to remember. A soldier played with his dog. In the distance, The camp orchestra began to play a march, cheerful, steady, grotesquely out of place. Music kept order. It masked the chaos, soothed the incoming transports, and reminded the guards that this was, in their eyes, civilization at work. Inside the gates, those chosen for labor were led through registration. Names were taken, heads were shaved, clothing replaced with striped uniforms. Their possessions disappeared into storage, later sorted in the warehouses known cynically as Canada, because, in the imagination of the starving prisoners, Canada was a land of plenty. There, every suitcase was opened, every seam cut, every photograph discarded. Gold fillings were pried from teeth, wedding rings melted down. Even hair was saved, stuffed into sacks to be used in German factories. It was not just murder, it was consumption. Nothing was wasted. And still, the system required order. Prisoners were assigned blocks, barracks, and tasks. Some were sent to the coal mines or construction crews. Others worked in the crematoria or sorted the belongings of the dead. The Sonderkommando lived closest to hell, forced to carry bodies from gas chambers to furnaces to erase the traces of mass murder, knowing their own lives were temporary. Few of them survived long. The SS regularly executed entire groups of Sonderkommando to eliminate witnesses. Yet even they found ways to resist smuggling notes, burying testimonies, sabotaging machinery. They knew history would need proof. For new prisoners, the first nights were the hardest. The stench of burning flesh hung in the air. The barracks were overcrowded, the straw filthy, the air suffocating. Roll calls stretched for hours in the freezing dark. Anyone who stumbled was beaten. Anyone who spoke was punished. The numbers on their arms were freshly inked, a replacement for their names. Slowly, the realization dawned. The work was not meant to sustain life, it was meant to exhaust it. There was a rhythm to destruction. Morning roll call, labor, punishment. Evening soup, count, silence. Sundays were for executions. The gallows stood in the open square, a reminder to every eye that resistance was futile. Yet, paradoxically, it was in that despair that small acts of courage were born. A stolen piece of bread, a whispered prayer, a smuggled letter, each one a defiance of annihilation. Outside the fences, local villagers could see the smoke. They smelled it when the wind shifted. Some pretended not to notice, others whispered in fear. A few brave souls left food near the outer wire for prisoners working in labor detachments. Most simply, kept their eyes down. Terror breeds silence. As 1,943 turned to 1,944, the scale of arrival reached its peak. Entire communities were emptied in days. From Greece, from France, from Hungary, endless trains. The ramp overflowed. The SS could no longer keep pace. New crematoria were built, larger, faster. The air turned black. The soil beneath the tracks became slick with ash. Even then, the arrivals continued to believe the lie. Mothers still braided their daughters' hair before entering the so-called showers. Fathers still carried infants. Rabbis whispered blessings, and the guards, trained to efficiency, continued to direct them with the same calm detachment as a customs officer at a border. One survivor later said that the cruelest part of Auschwitz was not the death, but the calm. It was the stillness, he said. The guards did not shout because they did not need to. Everything was already decided. Among the prisoners who worked on the ramp, the duty of sorting belongings was unbearable. They found letters, children's toys, unopened food, family photographs. Sometimes they saw their own relatives' names on the luggage. To survive meant to keep moving, to not think, to not remember. Memory itself was a form of suffering. And yet, memory persisted. Prisoners secretly passed information to the Polish underground. Some hid notes in cracks in the barracks, describing the layout of the camp. In one such message, discovered decades later, a prisoner had written simply, "If you find this, know that we were here. Remember us." At night, when the sirens stopped and the guards retreated to their quarters, the camp fell into a heavy silence. The sky glowed faintly red from the crematoria. Dogs barked occasionally, then nothing. The prisoners lay awake, listening to the sound of breathing, fragile, terrified, human. Some prayed for death, others for one more day. The SS officers wrote reports. Everything was accounted for: arrivals, selections, deaths, labor output. Bureaucracy gave the horror its disguise. Paperwork reduced people to numbers, numbers to quotas. The system's brilliance was in its banality. No single man felt responsible, because each had only followed his task. But every train that arrived, every name crossed off a list, brought the machinery closer to its breaking point. By late 1944, even the most devoted SS men began to sense the end. Allied bombs thundered in the distance. The Reich was shrinking. Still, the orders came. Continue, continue. The trains must not stop. When the last transports rolled in Hungarian Jews, Roma families, prisoners from Lodz, the ramp was a scene from the edge of time. Snow fell lightly over the ashes. The orchestra played its tune. And through the falling flakes, new arrivals walked toward the gates, past the words Arbeit macht frei, unaware that behind them, the world was beginning to collapse. Those who lived to remember spoke later of that gate, not as an entrance, but as a mirror. It reflected the civilization that had built it, the obedience that sustained it, and the indifference that allowed it to endure. The gate still stands today, rusted and heavy with memory. Tourists pass beneath it quietly, often whispering as if afraid to disturb the ghosts that linger there. And perhaps that is what Auschwitz teaches most deeply, that horror does not always announce itself with screams. Sometimes it comes with order, with paperwork, with a sign wrought in iron that promises freedom while leading to fire. For the survivors, the memory of that arrival never faded. They could still hear the whistle of the train, the scrape of boots, the first command shouted in German. They could still see the gate opening, wide enough for a world to disappear inside. History would later call it a crime. The law would call it genocide. But for those who stepped through that gate, it was something harder to name the moment the world ended and silence began. And so, the gate remains, a wound in iron. Beneath it lie the echoes of millions who passed through and never returned. Above it, the words still catch the light of the morning sun. Work makes you free. They do not fool anyone anymore. The experiments and the doctors. In the world outside Auschwitz, medicine was a symbol of progress. Doctors healed the sick, extended life, fought disease. But inside these fences, medicine was turned inside out. Healing became harm, science became cruelty, and the white coat became a disguise for death. When the first camp infirmary was established in 1941, it was not built to care for the sick but to study them. Behind its doors, the promise of medical ethics collapsed entirely. What began as observation soon became experimentation, and what began as experimentation became extermination by science. The man who came to embody this twisted transformation was Dr. Joseph Mengele, tall, neatly dressed, and disturbingly polite. Prisoners remembered his calm voice, his gloved hands, his faint smile. To them, he seemed less like a man and more like a ghost moving through smoke. Yet behind that composure was a mind devoted to cold curiosity. Mengele was not a monster by instinct, he was one by conviction. Before the war, he had studied anthropology and genetics, focusing on heredity and the causes of physical difference. In Nazi ideology, such research had a purpose to prove the supremacy of the Aryan race and to eradicate those deemed unfit. Auschwitz, with its endless supply of human subjects, became his laboratory. Each morning, Mengele arrived at the ramp in spotless boots, clipboard in hand, deciding with a simple gesture who would live and who would die. But he reserved a special fascination for twins, dwarfs, and those with unusual traits. For research, he would say, as if the word could soften what it meant. The twins, often children, were taken to Block 10, or to a separate laboratory in Birkenau. There, they were measured, photographed, catalogued. Blood was drawn daily, injections followed, sometimes salt water, sometimes chemicals, sometimes bacteria. No explanations were given. When one twin died, the other was killed immediately so their bodies could be compared. Those who survived remembered his charm, the way he would pat their heads, offer candy, speak kindly before the needles came. That contrast made the cruelty unbearable. Mengele was not alone. Dr. Karl Klauberg conducted sterilization experiments on women, injecting caustic substances into their wombs to find efficient methods of preventing reproduction. Dr. Horst Schumann exposed prisoners to X-rays, burning their flesh as he studied the effects of radiation. Dr. Eduard Werths, the camp's chief medical officer, supervised operations without anesthesia to test endurance. To the doctors, the prisoners were not people, they were variables. Each experiment had a purpose: to advance racial science, to test pharmaceuticals, to aid the military, and each had a justification: for the Reich, for knowledge, for necessity. The SS recorded results carefully. Charts were drawn, autopsies performed, reports filed. Some of this data would later resurface in scientific journals, stripped of its origins, its human cost hidden behind sterile language. Inside the so-called hospital blocks, the conditions were beyond comprehension. The stench of infection and decay filled the air. Rows of bodies lay on wooden bunks, some still breathing, some already gone. Prisoners were sent there not to recover, but to die away from view. Injections of phenol were administered directly into the heart, quick, efficient, silent. Nurses, themselves prisoners, were forced to assist. They held hands, whispered prayers, and hoped to be spared another day. There was one woman, Dr. Gisela Perl, a Jewish gynecologist from Romania, who was forced to work under Mengele's supervision. She later recalled that her task was to keep pregnant women alive long enough to be examined. But if the SS discovered a pregnancy, the mother and child were both sent to the gas chambers. To save them, Perl performed secret abortions in the dark, without tools, without anesthesia. She saved hundreds, though she said afterward, "I saved mothers by destroying their children." The words haunted her until her death. For the prisoners, the sight of a white coat became more terrifying than that of a gun. At least a gun promised an end. The doctor's visit meant something slower, something colder, being turned into a specimen. One of the most grotesque projects was the collection of human skeletons for the University of Strasbourg. Hundreds of prisoners were selected, measured, and photographed before being gassed so that their skeletons could be preserved for anatomical study. The scientists who requested them used university letterhead. Bureaucracy had made atrocity respectable. And yet, even within this horror, contradictions lingered. Some SS doctors tried to reduce suffering where they could. Dr. Werths once halted an experiment he deemed too cruel, but not because he opposed killing, only because he feared it might spread disease and slow the work. Morality itself had been reshaped to serve efficiency. Those subjected to experiments were called patients, but their treatment had nothing to do with care. In the typhus block, men and women were infected deliberately so that new vaccines could be tested. They burned with fever, delirious, often begging for water. When they died, their organs were dissected, their results noted. Subject did not survive. One report read as if survival had ever been possible. The cold water experiments were among the most infamous. Prisoners were immersed in freezing tanks to study hypothermia and survival rates for Luftwaffe pilots shot down over the sea. Many died within hours, their limbs turning blue, their hearts slowing. Others were revived only to be tested again. In another project, burns were inflicted using phosphorus to mimic battlefield injuries. The wounds were left untreated or were dressed with untested drugs. The agony was beyond description, and through it all, the doctors wrote, measured, recorded. They believed themselves scientists, even as they unmade what it meant to be human. To the outside world, such things seemed unimaginable, but within Auschwitz, they became routine. The camp's rhythm selections, experiments, executions unfolded with bureaucratic calm. And yet, The prisoners remembered the sounds, the scraping of metal trays, the clicking of boots, the quiet voices of doctors discussing dosage and reaction. Sometimes, as the experiments were conducted, other prisoners nearby heard laughter. Not loud, but soft, the laughter of men who had forgotten that their subjects could hear them. It was not laughter of joy, but of detachment, the final step in the transformation of the healer into the killer. Years later, at the Nuremberg doctor's trial, the world would hear testimony about what had happened. Charts, photographs, and instruments were displayed. Men who had once sworn the Hippocratic Oath stood accused of crimes against humanity. They claimed obedience, duty, ignorance. The court disagreed. The verdicts that followed established a new code, the Nuremberg Code, declaring that no medical experiment could be conducted without voluntary consent. But that law, born from horror, could not resurrect those whose bodies had been used to create it. Among the ruins of Auschwitz today, Block 10 still stands. The windows are sealed, the walls quiet. Visitors pass through slowly, their footsteps echoing on the floors where screams once rose. On the walls, faint scratches remain, marks made by hands that tried to remember they were still alive. Inside one of the preserved rooms, a single steel table sits under a light. It is clean now, empty, but it radiates the weight of all that happened there. Some say you can feel the air change not with ghosts, but with memory. It is said that one night, near the war's end, when Soviet forces were nearing Poland, Mengele loaded his files into a truck and fled. He escaped capture, living for decades under false names in South America. He died quietly on a beach in Brazil in 1979, unpunished, unrepentant. The irony was bitter. The man who had experimented endlessly on death drowned by accident, far from the ashes he created. But history did not let him vanish. Survivors like twins, Eva Moses Kor and Miriam Moses, kept his memory alive, not with hatred, but with testimony. Eva once said, "The greatest revenge is to live." Her voice, gentle and steady, became a final rebuke to the man who had tried to measure her worth with a syringe. In the years after liberation, the medical experiments of Auschwitz became symbols of the ultimate moral collapse. They forced the world to ask new questions. How can knowledge exist without conscience? How can progress justify pain? How can medicine survive when it forgets mercy? For those who were there, the answer was simple: it cannot. Auschwitz turned doctors into destroyers, nurses into accomplices, science into a weapon. Yet, even in that darkness, a few lights flickered: the prisoner who smuggled a vial of medicine to a sick friend, the nurse who whispered comfort before the injection, the survivor who told the world what had been done. Because in the end, that is how the healing began, not through medicine, but through memory. Today, when visitors stand before the remnants of Block 10, the silence feels heavier than any sound. The air is still, the rooms are bare, but the presence remains. Every wall, every corner, holds the question that haunts humanity still. When knowledge forgets compassion, what does it become? The doctors of Auschwitz answered that question in their time, and history, in remembering them, answers it for all time. Life inside the barbed wire. For those who entered Auschwitz and were not sent to immediate death, existence became a narrow corridor between survival and despair. Inside the barbed wire, time no longer moved forward, it merely circled, day after day, beneath gray skies and watchful towers. The first thing prisoners learned was silence. Silence was safety. To speak, to cry, to question, any of these could bring a blow, a bullet, or worse. The camp was a place where words were dangerous, where even hope had to whisper. Each dawn began with the siren, a shrill, metallic note that pierced the cold. Prisoners stumbled from their bunks before light, bones aching, bodies hollowed by hunger. They stood in lines on the frost-hardened ground for roll call, often lasting hours. Guards counted and recounted. Those who collapsed were beaten or left where they fell. If a count didn't match, the entire block was forced to stand until night returned. Some mornings, frost glittered on the barbed wire. Others brought rain or snow. The smell of burning never left. It clung to everything: clothing, skin, breath. It became part of the air itself, so constant that newcomers noticed it only for a day or two before it seemed normal. That, perhaps, was the cruelest trick of all. Horror turned to routine. Food was scarce: a crust of bread, a watery soup, sometimes a thin slice of sausage, if the guards were in a generous mood. Men and women learned to eat slowly, to chew even air, to hide scraps under straw. The hunger never stopped. It was an ache that hollowed thought, a dull drumbeat in the stomach that outlasted fear. For many, work was the only measure of time. Labor was not a punishment, but a design to exhaust the body until it ceased to be useful. Prisoners built roads, dug trenches, carried bricks for miles. They marched in lines, their wooden clogs slapping the ground, their striped uniforms flapping in the wind like tattered flags. The overseers, often SS guards or prisoner functionaries called capos, drove them relentlessly. Some capos were cruel, others quietly kind, risking death to slip extra rations or words of warning. But trust was dangerous. In Auschwitz, everyone learned that mercy could cost a life. At the IG Farben factory near Monowitz, thousands labored on industrial projects for the German war machine. The company's executives called it cheap labor. In truth, it was death by work. Shifts lasted 12 hours, often longer. Machinery tore flesh, chemical fumes burned lungs, and accidents were frequent. If a man fell behind, he was replaced. If he weakened, he vanished, transferred, the guards said, though everyone knew the word meant something else. Amid this daily grind, small communities formed in whispers. Prisoners shared crumbs, guarded secrets, taught each other languages. A Polish teacher gave lessons in history at night, speaking softly under the noise of boots. A rabbi led prayers without books, recalling each word from memory. A violinist, his fingers swollen, played music on strings, frayed from scavenged wire. The human spirit, though beaten, starved, and desecrated, refused to vanish completely. There were rare moments of fragile comfort. A sunrise glimpsed through wire, a stolen smile, a song murmured in the dark. Even laughter, quick, nervous, absurd, sometimes returned. It was not happiness, but defiance. Each smile was an act of rebellion, proof that the system could not erase everything. Disease, however, was the true master of Auschwitz. Typhus spread quickly, carried by lice. Prisoners scratched their arms raw. Fever swept through the barracks. The sick were sent to the infirmary, where most never returned. Medicine was scarce, mercy rarer. Injections of phenol ended suffering quickly and quietly. The infirmary itself was both sanctuary and trap. For some, it meant a day of rest. For others, it meant the gas chamber. Doctors selected the weakest for treatment, a euphemism the prisoners came to understand all too well. Still, they went when they could no longer stand, hoping for even an hour without pain. In this world, moral lines blurred. Survival required choices that no one could judge. A stolen crust might save one person and doom another. A whispered warning could lead to death for both. And yet, even in these impossible calculations, fragments of humanity endured: a hand held through fever, a child protected, a prayer shared in secret. Women faced their own torments. They were shaved upon arrival, stripped of everything, herded into overcrowded blocks where lice and despair bred freely. Yet within those walls, resilience bloomed quietly. Some formed small circles, invisible families of mutual care. They washed each other's faces with snow, shared the warmth of touch, whispered stories from before the war. They spoke of dresses once worn, of children lost, of homes that seemed now like dreams. There were mothers who hid pregnancies until discovery meant death. There were girls who smuggled scraps of bread to the younger ones. There were moments when the guards turned away, and a lullaby, soft, trembling, half-forgotten, drifted through the night. For the children, life inside the barbed wire was incomprehensible. Some were used for experiments. Others survived by hiding, by becoming invisible. A few older prisoners acted as protectors, inventing small games, pretending that the chimneys were clouds, not fire. Their innocence gave meaning to those who had none left. The camp's structure relied on fear but also on hierarchy. Prisoners were divided by nationality, by color of their triangles: red for politicals, green for criminals, yellow for Jews, pink for homosexuals, black for asocials. This system of symbols turned suffering into administration. It made solidarity dangerous, and yet solidarity persisted. In the spring of 1944, rumors spread, whispers that the Red Army was advancing, that liberation might come, but hope was double-edged. It sustained life, yet it also brought punishment. Anyone caught spreading defeatist talk was hanged in front of the entire camp. Executions were public lessons. Prisoners were forced to watch, to remove their caps, to stand while the condemned were made examples. Silence followed, a silence so heavy it seemed to crush the air. Then came the command, "Caps on," and the day continued as if nothing had happened. Inside the women's camp, there was one exception to this endless submission, a rare spark of rebellion. In October 1944, members of the Sonderkommando, assisted by a group of women prisoners, managed to blow up Crematorium 4 using smuggled gunpowder stolen from a munitions factory. The explosion shattered windows, burned machinery, and killed several guards. For a brief moment, chaos reigned. It was the only uprising in Auschwitz's history. It was crushed swiftly. The women among them, Rosa Robota, Alla Gertner, and Estera Wageblum, were tortured and publicly hanged. Before her death, Rosa whispered to her comrades, "Be strong." Her final words echoed through the camp for days. Even the guards heard them. After that, the barbed wire seemed sharper, the watchtowers taller, the cold deeper. But the memory of resistance endured like a spark beneath ashes. At night, some prisoners dreamed of bread, others dreamed of home. A few dreamed of nothing at all. Dreams were dangerous, because waking always meant returning to Auschwitz. Yet those dreams kept them alive, proof that imagination itself was resistance. The seasons changed. The snow melted, revealing bones in the mud. Summer came, and with it the stench of decay. Insects swarmed, fires burned day and night, the air shimmered with heat and smoke. Through it all, the work continued. The trains arrived, the chimneys smoked. To live meant to adapt, to count steps, to read guards' moods, to find shade when possible, to trade small favors. Survival became a science of observation. You learn to see without looking, one survivor later said, to listen without turning your head. Even so, death was everywhere: in the infirmary, in the fields, in the roll call square. Sometimes it came swiftly, sometimes slowly, one breath at a time, but it was never unexpected. Auschwitz taught people to stop fearing death and to start fearing tomorrow. As months blurred into years, new prisoners replaced the old. The camp seemed eternal, an entire universe behind wire. Yet change was coming. By late 1944, the sound of distant artillery reached the guards' ears. Whispers spread again: "The Russians are near." The SS grew harsher, desperate. They executed anyone too weak to march, burned records, dismantled evidence. The prisoners, skeletal and exhausted, sensed both dread and hope. When liberation finally came, it was not a moment of joy, but of disbelief. The Soviet soldiers who entered in January 1945 found not defiance, but silence. 7,000 survivors remained barely alive, eyes sunken, bodies skeletal, yet breathing. The barbed wire still stood, the watchtowers still cast their shadows, but the guns were quiet at last. For the survivors, freedom felt foreign. Some could not leave. They lingered near the barracks, afraid of open space, unable to believe that the gates no longer held power. Others wandered through the camp in numb silence, searching for names, for faces, for anything familiar. It took weeks to bury the dead, months to clean the disease, years to heal the memory. And even then, healing was incomplete. For how could one heal from a place designed to destroy the very meaning of life? In the decades that followed, those who lived carried the camp within them in scars, in nightmares, in silence. Some spoke, others never could, but their stories would come to define not just what happened inside the barbed wire, but what it meant to be human after it. Because Auschwitz was not only a place where millions died, it was also a place where the smallest flicker of kindness, a shared crumb, a whispered name, a hand clasped in the dark became an act of rebellion. Inside those fences, humanity itself became resistance. And that resistance, faint as it was, survived. Voices of Resistance Auschwitz was built to erase the idea of resistance. Its fences were designed not only to keep prisoners in, but to contain even the thought of defiance. The SS controlled every breath, every ration, every rumor, and yet, within this machinery of obedience, whispers of rebellion endured, fragile, flickering, but alive. Resistance inside Auschwitz was not born in the open. It was born in silence, in stolen glances, in hidden scraps of paper, in the quiet exchange of courage between one doomed soul and another. To resist in a place designed for death was not simply to fight, it was to affirm one's humanity when the world insisted there was none left. The first kind of resistance was memory itself. Prisoners understood that if they could not stop the killing, they could at least preserve the truth. From the earliest days, they began to write secretly, dangerously, in code, in fragments, on paper scavenged from the SS offices. They buried notes under barrack floors, hid photographs in bottles, carved names into bricks. One such note, discovered decades later in the ruins of Crematorium 3, read simply, "We worked here. We saw it all. Tell the world." Among the earliest resistors was the Polish underground network inside the camp. It began with men who had been soldiers before their capture. Among them, Captain Witold Pilecki, a name whispered with reverence among survivors. He did not stumble into Auschwitz by fate. He walked into it deliberately. In 1940, Pilecki volunteered to be arrested. His mission was madness: to infiltrate Auschwitz, organize resistance, and send reports to the Polish Home Army. Using a false name, he was captured in a German roundup and deported to the camp. Once inside, he built one of the most extraordinary underground networks in history. He smuggled information to the outside through coded messages, reporting the camp's structure, the numbers of the dead, the growing system of extermination. He helped organize secret food distribution, mutual aid, and even small sabotage tools deliberately damaged, machinery broken just enough to slow production. For 3 years, Pilecki lived inside the barbed wire, risking his life daily to bear witness. In 1943, he escaped, carrying with him documents and testimony that would reach the Allies. His reports were so horrific that many in London refused to believe them, but he had told the truth. Resistance, however, was not limited to the Polish underground. In every corner of the camp, small acts of defiance emerged, each one a declaration that the spirit had not yet been destroyed. Prisoners shared forbidden prayers, saved others' lives by swapping identity numbers, sabotaged weapons, or hid the weak during selections. These were not gestures of hope alone, they were acts of war against despair itself. The women of Auschwitz became a central part of this quiet rebellion. In the munitions factory near Birkenau, a group of women, Rosa Robota, Alla Gertner, Estera Wajblum, and Regina Safirstein, smuggled gunpowder grain by grain, hidden in scraps of clothing, pockets, and hair. Over months, they collected enough to arm the Sonderkommando, the forced laborers who worked in the crematoria. On the 7th of October 1944, the spark finally ignited. The Sonderkommando at Crematorium 4 revolted, attacking the guards with hammers, axes, and stones. They set the crematorium ablaze, killing several SS men before being overpowered. Explosions echoed through the camp, brief, defiant thunder against the silence of years. Hundreds were executed in retaliation. The women who had smuggled the gunpowder were tortured and hanged in front of the assembled prisoners. Their final words were spoken through broken lips, "Be strong." Their courage lived longer than the walls that confined them. There were other forms of resistance, subtler, quieter, but no less profound. Doctors in the infirmary secretly diagnosed healthy prisoners as sick to spare them from death marches. Teachers taught children in whispers after dark. Artists drew what they saw, knowing their sketches might outlive them. Some guards looked the other way, just once, and in doing so risked everything. Even faith became rebellion. Jews recited Kaddish under their breath for those lost. Catholics fashioned crosses from bits of wire. A rabbi once used a crust of bread to bless the dying. Each act said the same thing: we are still human, even here. There were escape attempts, a few successful, many not. Some crawled through sewers, others cut through the wire at night. A handful made it. Their stories reached the outside world through the Polish resistance and the Vatican, through whispers to Switzerland, through intercepted messages. But for most, escape ended in the sound of dogs and gunfire. Still, they tried. One of the most daring attempts was made by two Slovak Jews, Rudolf Verba and Alfred Wetzler. In April 1944, they escaped from Birkenau after hiding in a woodpile for 3 days, masked by tobacco and gasoline to confuse the dogs. They made their way across Poland, reaching Slovakia, where they wrote a detailed report, 32 pages of names, maps, and descriptions. Their document, known later as the Verba-Wetzler Report, revealed the existence of gas chambers and crematoria, the estimated numbers of victims, the process of selection and extermination. It was smuggled to the Allies, printed in newspapers, and used to pressure world leaders to act. When news reached Hungary that deportations would lead to death at Auschwitz, international outrage forced the temporary suspension of transports. Tens of thousands of lives were saved not by armies, but by 2 men who refused to die silently. Inside the camp, resistance was not always physical. Sometimes it was spiritual, emotional, even artistic. Prisoners composed poems and songs, fragile creations in a world that forbade creation. One melody, remembered by survivors, carried the refrain, "We are still here, though the night is long." These were not songs of victory. They were songs of endurance, small bridges of sound across the gulf of despair. Auschwitz also saw resistance from within the Sonderkommando, men forced to destroy the evidence of genocide. They knew they were living on borrowed time. Every few months, the SS executed one group and replaced them with another. Yet even as they worked, under constant threat, they recorded what they saw. In 1944, a group of Sonderkommando members buried photographs near the crematoria, smuggled images showing piles of bodies, burning pits, and the chambers themselves. These photographs, developed after the war, became some of the only visual proof of the extermination process. The men who took them were killed soon after, but their images spoke louder than any words could. There were also moments of quiet resistance from unexpected places. A few civilian workers, Polish laborers and railwaymen, risked their lives to smuggle food, to pass letters, to guide escapees. Some were caught and executed. Others survived, haunted by what they had seen but proud of what they had done. Resistance inside Auschwitz was not defined by success or failure. It was defined by defiance. Every act, no matter how small, challenged the logic of the camp. Every loaf of bread shared, every word of prayer, every refusal to betray another was a victory measured not in outcomes, but in meaning. After liberation, survivors often spoke of guilt, guilt for living, guilt for not fighting more, guilt for breathing when others had been silenced. But those who studied their stories later understood. To survive in Auschwitz was itself an act of rebellion. The Nazis wanted erasure. The survivors refused to disappear. When the war ended, the memory of those underground movements, of those smuggled messages, of those who shouted "Be strong" as they died, became a second resistance, the resistance of remembrance. Historians later uncovered fragments of the Sonderkommando writings, buried in bottles and cans beneath the ashes. They spoke in simple, unpolished sentences, testimonies from men who knew they would not live but refused to vanish. "We have seen the flames," one wrote. "Tell our story, so the world cannot say it did not know." And so, decades later, their words rose again. Today, when visitors walk the paths between the barracks, it is hard to imagine that beneath their feet lies a map of defiance, a hidden world of courage that once breathed under the weight of death. The wind moves through the wire, the gravel crunches softly underfoot, and if one listens closely, one might almost hear those voices still low, steady, unbroken. They do not shout, they do not weep, they simply endure, as they did then. Because even in a place built to destroy every trace of resistance, humanity resisted still. Liberation, the 27th of January 1945. On one biting cold winter morning, as the wind howled over the frozen fields of southern Poland, the soldiers of the 60th Army of the Eastern Front of World War II stepped through gates that had stood silent for years. Gates with the iron sign Arbeit macht frei. They entered not as liberators heralding triumph, but as witnesses arriving too late on a terrain scarred beyond their preparation. When the Soviet troops arrived at the former camp of Auschwitz-Birkenau, they did not find a well-ordered facility. They found ruins, ash, skeletal remains, and survivors so thin as to be shadows of human beings. The chimneys still loomed, but their flames had died. The rail lines ended at empty barracks, yet the silence that filled the place was as loud as the worst screams. In the weeks leading to the arrival, the SS had acted in panic. With the Soviet advance nearing, they ordered evacuation of tens of thousands of prisoners in forced marches across snow-covered fields. They dynamited crematoria, burned records, dumped ashes, and fled. What they left behind was the evidence of their own method, the remains of a death machine in disarray. When the gates opened, approximately 7,000 prisoners remained. Some were too weak to crawl, some lay on their bunks, some wandered aimlessly through the snowbound yards. Their eyes were vacant, their bodies collapsed, their concept of time lost. The world outside had moved on. These had not. The soldiers did what they could. They brought blankets, food, medical supplies, but the damage was deep. Typhus raged, pneumonia spread like wildfire, starvation had hollowed hearts and minds alike. Many died shortly after liberation, some succumbing to wounds, some to the despair that lingered. Liberation did not mean immediate healing. It meant survival under new conditions. For many of the survivors, step by step, life changed. They faced not only the physical world, but the emotional world of what had happened to them. And that world was heavy. The survivors, once prisoners, now had to ask, "Who am I now? What do I believe in after the smoke and the selections? How do I carry a life when so many did not?" Media crews arrived, photographers clicked their cameras, journalists spoke with people who could barely lift their heads. Images of piles of shoes, of children's clothing, of human hair in sacks, of ashes swirling in the wind, reached the world beyond Poland, shocking countries that had known war, but not this scale of death. The world began to understand, however slowly, what Auschwitz had cost. Not just lives, but humanity. For the local population around Auschwitz, the event was surreal. Some walked cautiously through the gates with the Russian soldiers. Others waited outside, not ready to face what they had ignored for so long. The land had held their lives. It also held the evidence of horrors. Liberation unleashed a long-deferred reckoning. Survivors in the weeks after found themselves in a strange space, no longer prisoners, yet hardly free. Some returned to the camp repeatedly, drawn to the ground they had walked, to the barracks where they had lived, to the creaky floors and cold walls that had heard their voices. Others could not bear to look. Some never spoke again. The silence of memory can be heavier than the noise of captivity. The war itself was still going on. In Germany, the Reich was collapsing, but for those inside Auschwitz, freedom already arrived. The gates stood open. The operation was over, and yet the work of living had just begun. They were given documents of release, But for many, that paper meant little. They had no homes to go to, no families left, no jobs, no futures. Displacement became their next bond. Many were taken to field hospitals. Some died there. Others moved on to displaced persons camps across Europe. There they learned again how to eat, how to sleep, how to hope. Some picked up languages, some waited for visas, some tried to recover names they had lost. They met other survivors from different countries. They shared stories, sometimes in broken sentences, sometimes in silence. The world would call them survivors, but inside, they felt the weight of lives interrupted. Liberation also meant storytelling. The survivors carried something the world needed, not just their lives, but their memory. They described what the doctors had done, what the selection ramp had looked like, how the chimneys roared and the ash fell like snow. Their voices became the foundation of testimony, of justice, of remembrance. The physical remains of the camp became monuments to what had been. Within years, the Polish government established the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum, 1947. Visitors walked the barracks, the watchtowers, the crematoria, the rail ramp. The ground held its story. The rusted fences testified. To walk there was not tourism. It was bearing witness. But witness is incomplete without reckoning. Courts convened, trials were held. The knowledge of what had happened at Auschwitz became a global concern. Legal frameworks for crimes against humanity and genocide emerged. Yet many survivors found that justice was partial, delayed, or denied entirely. Even so, the fact of liberation meant that their suffering would be seen. The memory of Auschwitz reached far beyond the camp itself. It entered literature books like Night, If This Is a Man, film, education, museums. It asked uncomfortable questions of every generation. How could we stand by? Why did we fail? And what happens when we forget? For those who walked out alive, the gate they passed beneath remained a symbol. For many, the tattoos on their arms were the first maps of that journey the moment they entered, the moment they left. The mark stayed when names were forgotten. The world changed around them. Nations reconstructed. Families reformed. But within them, the events at Auschwitz did not end. They built new lives, but the memory remained. Some used it to teach, others turned away, preferring silence. Many believed that silence would protect them. Yet the silence often became the heaviest part. Time does not heal all wounds, but it does demand new questions. How do we remember the ones who cannot tell their story? How do we honor the ones who did not survive? Conservationists restored barracks, preserved chimneys, stabilized ruins. Educators created curriculums, museums ran tours for young people. And the gate remained, the sign above, still catching the light of every new dawn. Liberation at Auschwitz was not an end. It was the beginning of a long journey of survival, of memory, of responsibility. The world had entered the camp. The world now had to carry its legacy. To walk out of the gate, free is precious. But to carry what happened inside with honesty, meaning, and action, that is rarer still. And that is why the work of liberation continues. The reckoning. The gates of Auschwitz stood open, but the world beyond them was not ready for what lay inside. When the soldiers of the Soviet 60th Army first stepped through the snow toward the long brick buildings, they did not enter a fortress or a battlefield. They entered a graveyard without headstones, a place where time had stopped. They found 7,000 survivors, men, women, and children, who no longer looked like themselves. Some lay motionless on wooden bunks, eyes open but unseeing. Others crawled through the snow, too weak to stand. The smell of sickness filled the air, typhus, dysentery, rot. And then there were the objects. Shoes piled high like mountains, glasses by the thousands, piles of hair, baby clothes, suitcases still marked with names. Each object was a voice that had been silenced. The soldiers did not shout or celebrate. Many simply removed their hats, standing still among the ruins. Some wept quietly. These men, hardened by years of battle on the Eastern Front, found themselves unprepared for this not war, but the evidence of something deeper, colder, and more deliberate than war. Liberation came not as triumph, but as revelation. The scale of it all, the careful organization, the precision, the method forced humanity to confront its own reflection. For the survivors, however, liberation did not feel like freedom. It felt like stepping out of a nightmare only to find the world still gray, unfamiliar, and cold. In the first days after the Soviet arrival, field hospitals were set up in nearby towns. Doctors and nurses moved through the barracks, carrying blankets, medicine, and whatever food they could find. But the damage was far beyond physical. Some prisoners died even as help reached them, their bodies unable to handle nourishment after years of starvation. Others survived but drifted in confusion, asking questions no one could answer. Where is my mother? Where did they take my brother? Who am I now? The soldiers buried the dead in mass graves. They documented everything, photographs, film reels, testimony as evidence of what they had found. And still, the scale could not be captured by any lens. The silence that lingered over the camp seemed to absorb even the sound of their footsteps. As word spread, journalists and allied investigators arrived. They took photographs of the piles of shoes, of the faces of the survivors, of the long chimneys rising against the sky. These images traveled the world, published in newspapers that had spent years doubting the rumors of extermination. Now the proof was undeniable. The Nazi system of camps was no longer an abstract accusation. It was visible, measurable, countable, and yet, even in the face of these revelations, disbelief persisted. The crimes of Auschwitz were so vast, so systematic, that they seemed to defy reason itself. How could a nation of poets and scientists, engineers and artists have built such a place? The reckoning had only begun. In the months that followed, the Soviets gathered evidence for war crimes trials. Testimonies were taken from survivors, local witnesses, and even captured SS officers. Documents were collected, lists compiled, photographs developed. Every fragment became part of the record. The survivors, meanwhile, began to leave. Some walked to nearby villages, searching for family. Others were transported to displaced persons, camps scattered across Europe. The Red Cross, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, and Jewish aid groups began to coordinate care. But the wounds went deeper than any agency could reach. For many, the question of home became unanswerable. Their towns had been destroyed, their families were gone, and even when they returned to the places they once lived, they found strangers in their houses, sometimes hostile, sometimes fearful, often unwilling to remember. In Poland, anti-Jewish violence continued even after the war's end. The survivors of Auschwitz found themselves once again searching for refuge. Meanwhile, in Germany, the machinery that had built Auschwitz stood exposed. Engineers, doctors, bureaucrats, all now faced scrutiny. The Allies prepared for the Nuremberg trials, the first attempt in history to bring an entire regime to justice. It was there that the term crimes against humanity entered human vocabulary. In the courtroom, photographs of Auschwitz were shown on a projector. Witnesses described the gas chambers, the crematoria, the selections. Prisoners' testimonies were read aloud, trembling, factual, unforgettable. For the first time, the world heard from those who had lived inside the system. One of them, a Polish prisoner, said quietly, "We did not die because we were guilty. We died because they were allowed." But justice was not swift. Many of the perpetrators escaped through chaos, fleeing to South America, changing names, blending into the crowd of displaced Europeans. Some were captured and tried in Poland. Others vanished for decades. The most infamous, Joseph Mengele, the so-called Angel of Death, lived in Brazil until 1979, never facing a courtroom. Rudolf Höss, the camp commandant, was captured in 1946, tried in Warsaw, and hanged on the grounds of Auschwitz itself within sight of the crematoriums he had once supervised. Before his death, he wrote a detailed confession describing the structure of the camp, the gas chambers, and the logistics of extermination. His words were chilling not for their horror, but for their calmness. There was no rage, no ideology, only a methodical recounting of industrialized murder. The Nuremberg trials, followed by the later Frankfurt Auschwitz trials in the 1960 seconds, gave survivors a platform to speak. Their testimonies pierced through the denial that lingered in post-war Europe. They described the daily life of the camp, the hunger, the selections, the sound of trains arriving at night. Each voice added weight to the growing truth that could never again be hidden. And yet, the reckoning was never complete. For every officer tried, 100 went free. For every confession, 1,000 names were lost. Justice, like survival, was partial and imperfect. The scale of the crime was too vast for any courtroom to contain. In Israel, the trial of Adolf Eichmann in 1961 marked another turning point. Captured by Mossad agents in Argentina, Eichmann was one of the bureaucratic architects of the final solution. A man who had never set foot in Auschwitz, yet helped design its purpose. His trial was broadcast across the world, and for the first time millions listened as survivors recounted their experiences. Eichmann sat behind glass, expressionless. When asked about his role, he said only, "I obeyed orders." Philosopher Hannah Arendt, covering the trial, coined the phrase the banality of evil. Evil, she observed, was not always monstrous. Sometimes it was ordinary, carried out by clerks, drivers, accountants, men in clean uniforms who believed they were only doing their duty. That realization shook the post-war world. Back in Poland, Auschwitz itself transformed into something new. In 1947, it became a state museum, the first of its kind. The barracks were cleaned but left empty. The gallows remained. The barbed wire was repaired but not replaced. Visitors walked through in silence, reading names, seeing photographs, tracing the rail line that still ended at the ramp of Birkenau. The museum was not built to explain, it was built to preserve. Its curators understood that no words could capture the experience. The camp itself was the testimony. Over time, the reckoning expanded beyond trials and museums. It entered art, film, and education. Writers like Primo Levi and Elie Wiesel carried Auschwitz into literature. Filmmakers like Claude Lanzmann and Steven Spielberg brought its memory to the screen. Teachers began including it in history lessons. What had once been hidden was now part of humanity's shared moral map, and yet, even as decades passed, the memory of Auschwitz remained fragile. Survivors aged, their voices trembling but clear. Many spoke for the first time only in old age. Others never spoke at all, leaving their stories in diaries found by their children. Each testimony was a fragment of a larger truth, that evil thrives not in chaos, but in order, in systems where cruelty becomes routine and silence becomes complicity. In Germany, the reckoning turned inward. School children visited former camps. Teachers led discussions about responsibility. The government enacted laws against Holocaust denial. Memorials rose in Berlin, Munich, and Hamburg, not as decorations, but as reminders. The nation that had built Auschwitz became the one most determined to remember it. But remembrance is not the same as understanding. Even today, the numbers defy comprehension. Over 1 million people murdered here, not in war, not in battle, but in the systematic pursuit of ideology. Their ashes scattered over ponds, their names lost to paperwork. For survivors, the reckoning never truly ended. Some found peace in faith, others in family, others in speaking their truth. But many lived in quiet torment, nightmares, guilt, and the weight of memory followed them into every day. They built new lives in Israel, the United States, Canada, Australia, yet carried Auschwitz with them wherever they went. One survivor, when asked late in life if he had forgiven, said softly, "Forgive? No, but I live, and that is my answer." The reckoning of Auschwitz is not measured in verdicts or museums. It is measured in vigilance, in the world's ability to recognize the early signs of hatred, to hear the echoes of that machinery in new forms, in new languages. The camp may be silent now, but its warning is alive. Every generation must face its own reckoning. The survivors are nearly gone. The witnesses are fading into history. And so the responsibility passes to us to remember, to teach, to guard the truth from distortion. Because the true liberation of Auschwitz was not the day its gates opened. It is the day humanity learns never to build such gates again. The aftermath, lives reborn from the ashes. The barbed wire still stood, though its current was gone. The watchtowers, once manned by the eyes of hatred, were empty now, silent, silhouettes against a gray winter sky. The snow had begun to melt across the fields of Auschwitz, revealing the bones of a world undone. For those who had survived, freedom did not come as a song of triumph, but as an ache, a confusion, a question that would echo through every year that followed. How does one live after surviving the impossible? When the gates opened, the survivors did not rush to leave. Many could not. Some were too weak to walk, others too afraid that the nightmare might begin again. Liberation had arrived, but understanding had not. Soviet soldiers and field doctors moved carefully among the barracks, stepping over the debris of years' broken spoons, torn shoes, the faint outlines of bodies frozen in straw. They offered food, blankets, medicine, but for many it was too late. The human body, starved and brutalized, sometimes failed when kindness finally returned. Hundreds died in the first weeks after liberation, their hearts unable to remember how to live. And yet, life flickered. In the cold air of January 1945, survivors began to help one another. They carried the sick, shared the bread they were given, buried the dead whose names they still remembered. A strange, quiet brotherhood grew among them, not of hope, not yet, but of endurance. Some began to clean the barracks, to gather wood for fires, to mark graves. Even amid the ashes, there was a whisper of order, a fragile rhythm of care. The world outside was beginning to stir, though it did not yet understand what had been found. Journalists arrived, wide-eyed and wordless. Soviet cameramen filmed the wreckage, piles of children's shoes, mounds of hair, spectacles by the thousands, suitcases neatly labeled in careful handwriting. These images, once developed, traveled the world. People who had doubted the rumors of extermination saw the proof in grain and shadow. But the truth was larger than any image could hold. What the lens could not capture was the silence, the thick, unending quiet that covered the camp like snow. For those who had survived, liberation was followed by uncertainty. Where would they go? Who was left? Lists of names began to appear, scrawled on walls, on scraps of paper pinned to trees. Passed from camp to camp, the Red Cross and aid organizations helped compile rosters of survivors. But the lists were always incomplete, the names often misspelled, the lines fading in rain. Men searched for wives, children asked for parents. A woman might walk for days to another camp, clutching a piece of paper with a name, only to find it crossed out. The dead were everywhere, but no one knew where they rested. And yet, amid the heartbreak, there were moments that seemed to defy logic. A father finding his daughter in a hospital tent. A brother recognizing a voice through a wall. A wedding band dug out from the dirt, returned to its owner after years. Such reunions were rare, fragile miracles in a world still trembling from ruin. But for most, the search ended in silence. Homes were gone, towns destroyed, families erased. When some returned to their villages, they found strangers living in their houses. Old neighbors turned away, uncomfortable with ghosts returning from camps they preferred not to remember. For many survivors, Europe itself had become a graveyard. They became wanderers once more, the displaced of the displaced. They walked westward, following rumors of safety, gathering in improvised refugee centers across Poland, Austria, and Germany. The world called them DPs, displaced persons, as if a bureaucratic label could contain the weight of what they carried. In those camps, rows of tents and wooden barracks were filled with the newly alive. Doctors treated the sick. Volunteers brought clothes and shoes. Children's laughter, faint at first, began to return. In these in-between places, survivors began to speak softly again, to write letters, to teach, to sing. It was here, amid the ruins, that new communities began to take shape. Some dreamed of America, others of Palestine, still others of simply a bed without fear. The Red Cross and United Nations agencies began organizing emigration. Ships sailed from Italy and France, carrying those who had survived the furnaces of Europe toward new worlds. But leaving did not mean forgetting. Each carried an invisible weight, the memory of faces, the sound of trains, the scent of smoke that lingered in their hair long after the wind had changed. Among those who stayed in Europe, many devoted their lives to testimony. They began to write. They filled notebooks with names and details before memory could fade. Primo Levi, Elie Wiesel, Viktor Frankl, each found language for what had once been unspeakable. Their words were not only for history, but for healing. They became the bridge between the living and the dead, between comprehension and the abyss. Through them, the world began to learn what no photograph could show: the inner landscape of survival. But life, for all its frailty, insisted on continuing. Babies were born in displaced persons camps, the first generation of children after Auschwitz. They were named after the lost, after mothers, fathers, siblings who would never return. Their cries echoed through the barracks that had once been silent. For their parents, each breath was both joy and defiance. To live was not only survival, it was a protest against annihilation. As months turned to years, survivors began to rebuild in places that felt safer. Israel, America, Argentina, Canada, Australia. They learned new languages, found work, married, raised children who would grow up in the sunlight their parents had been denied. Yet even as they built homes, they carried the camp with them, not in words, but in gestures, in the way they saved every crumb of bread, the way they hesitated before trusting, the way they flinched at the sound of barking dogs or trains passing at night. The body remembered what the mind tried to forget. In Israel, the stories of Auschwitz became part of the national identity, the warning that the Jewish people must never again be defenseless. In Germany, remembrance became a form of reckoning. The children of perpetrators grew up with questions their parents could not answer. In America, Holocaust survivors began speaking in schools and universities, turning their pain into education. Never again, they said, not as a slogan, but as a plea. For many, silence lasted decades. Some never spoke of what they had seen. Others told their stories only when they sensed their time was running short. They opened drawers and boxes filled with photographs, diaries, and letters. They wrote names for their grandchildren to remember. Their testimonies, once fragile and private, became the foundation of museums and archives. In the quiet light of reading rooms, their words would outlive them. But healing was uneven. Guilt haunted those who survived, when others had not. They asked themselves why they had lived while their friends had perished. Nightmares visited them in sleep, the sound of the whistle, the dogs, the roll call. Many carried invisible wounds. Yet even within that pain, they built lives of astonishing resilience. They became teachers, doctors, shopkeepers, poets. They planted gardens. They laughed again, though the laughter sometimes carried a shadow. Across Europe, cities rebuilt themselves, covering ruins with concrete and flowers. But beneath every foundation lay the echo of what had been lost. And on the plains of southern Poland, Auschwitz remained. The barracks were still standing, the chimneys still reaching toward the clouds. The Polish government, with survivors' support, turned the site into a museum in 1947. It was not to glorify suffering, but to preserve warning. Each building, each piece of clothing, each shoe behind the glass became a silent voice. Visitors walked through in hushed disbelief, feeling not the past, but its continued presence. For those who returned to visit, it was never easy. Some wept quietly, others stood for hours before the remains of the gas chambers, unable to move. One survivor, returning decades later, whispered to her guide, "It feels smaller than I remember, but heavier." Another said, "I came not to say goodbye, but to tell them I kept living." In that living lay the truest victory. The aftermath of Auschwitz did not end with the closing of its gates. It continues, quietly, wherever a survivor's story is told, wherever a child learns the meaning of that name. The ashes of the murdered became the soil of remembrance from which compassion and vigilance began to grow. From those ashes came laws against genocide, declarations of human rights, and a moral awakening that would shape the conscience of nations. The horror of Auschwitz taught the world not only about hatred, but about indifference, the danger of silence, of standing by. To live after Auschwitz was to carry two worlds within one heart, the world before, filled with laughter and faces now gone, and the world after, where memory became duty. For those who walked through its gates and saw them close behind them forever, life would never again be simple. But they carried on, they loved, they remembered, and in their quiet survival, they gave meaning to all that was lost. Auschwitz ended as a place, but not as a presence. It lingers wherever compassion falters, wherever prejudice stirs, wherever humanity forgets how thin the line is between cruelty and civilization. The survivors did not choose their role as witnesses, but they bore it, gently and fiercely, for all who came after. Their endurance turned ruin into testimony. Their lives, rebuilt from the ashes, became the living monuments no stone could replace, trials and testimonies. In the years that followed liberation, the world seemed to move on with astonishing speed. Cities were rebuilt, borders redrawn, nations reimagined. But somewhere beneath that reconstruction lay a quiet, gnawing question. How could civilization, with all its laws and learning, have produced Auschwitz? At first, there was silence. Many countries were exhausted. The victors wanted peace. The survivors wanted to disappear into anonymity, to build lives untouched by memories that burned. But the evidence remained in photographs, in documents, in ruins, in the eyes of those who had seen. The reckoning, delayed though it was, had to come. When it did, it began not with vengeance but with record-keeping. Mountains of Nazi paperwork were found across Germany and Poland transport lists, camp rosters, architectural drawings of gas chambers stamped with bureaucratic precision. The handwriting was neat, the signatures formal. Murder, it seemed, had been organized like an office routine. In November 1945, in the war-scarred city of Nuremberg, the world's first international tribunal opened its doors. 22 leading Nazi officials stood accused of crimes unprecedented in scale and cruelty. The courtroom smelled of damp wood and cigarette smoke. Translators whispered through headsets in 4 languages. For the first time in human history, entire systems, not only individuals, were on trial. Among the piles of exhibits were documents from Auschwitz, blueprints, telegrams, invoices for Zyklon B gas. The names of the murdered were read aloud, though they numbered in the millions. As prosecutors spoke, survivors listened from the gallery, their faces expressionless. Justice, they knew, could never equal what had been lost. Yet still they came to bear witness. One of the most striking moments came when films of the liberated camps were shown to the court. Grainy black and white footage projected on a trembling screen, skeletal figures, heaps of corpses, bulldozers pushing bodies into trenches. The room fell silent. Some of the defendants averted their eyes. Others stared, blankly, as if watching someone else's story. Nuremberg established a moral vocabulary for the modern age. Crimes against humanity, genocide, the responsibility of command. It declared that following orders was no defense. That obedience, when in service of evil, was guilt in itself. But the process was far from complete. Nuremberg judged those at the top, not the thousands of guards, doctors, and clerks who had made Auschwitz function. Their reckoning came later, in courtrooms scattered across Europe. In 1947, in the Polish city of Krakow, the trial of Rudolf Höss, Auschwitz's commandant, began. The man who had overseen the murder of over 1 million people stood in a wooden dock, pale and calm. He spoke with chilling precision about logistics, train schedules, capacity limits, the efficiency of gas. He seemed not cruel, only detached the embodiment of Hannah Arendt's phrase that would later define the era, the banality of evil. When the verdict was read, Hus showed no emotion. He was hanged at Auschwitz, beside the gallows he had ordered built. Survivors were allowed to watch, but few did. They had already seen enough death. Over the following decade, hundreds of smaller trials unfolded in Warsaw, Vienna, Munich, Frankfurt. Some defendants claimed ignorance, others claimed duty. Judges listened, historians took notes, but the enormity of the crime defied every legal scale. How do you sentence participation in the murder of 1 million souls? How do you measure complicity when evil had been dispersed across clerks, drivers, doctors, engineers, all acting within a system that normalized atrocity? By the late 1952, a new generation began to ask questions their parents had avoided. They wanted to know who had served in the camps, who had joined the party, who had turned away. It was the children of perpetrators, not the perpetrators themselves, who demanded clarity, and their voices brought the Holocaust back into Germany's quick consciousness. Then, in 1961, a moment of history unfolded half a world away. In Jerusalem, a gray-haired man sat behind a bulletproof glass booth. His name was Adolf Eichmann, the bureaucrat who had coordinated the deportation of Europe's Jews to the camps. Captured in Argentina by Israeli agents, he was flown to Israel to stand trial before the eyes of the world. The proceedings were broadcast live, the first trial many had ever seen on television. In living rooms from New York to Tel Aviv, people watched survivors step to the witness stand, their voices shaking but steady. They told of cattle cars, of selections, of families torn apart. They spoke not as historians but as memory itself. When asked to account for his actions, Eichmann replied with a phrase that chilled generations: "I obeyed orders." He spoke of timetables, of documents, of the language of bureaucracy. He had not killed, he said, he had organized. The banality of his tone shocked the world more than any outburst of hatred could have. Evil, it seemed, could wear the face of a clerk. Eichmann was found guilty and executed in 1962. His ashes were scattered at sea, the only burial the world would permit. But the impact of his trial reached far beyond justice. It made millions confront, for the first time, the full story of the Holocaust. Survivors who had remained silent began to speak. Books were written, school programs were formed. The age of public testimony had begun. Throughout the 1,960 seconds and 70 seconds, survivors became the living record of what had been done. They spoke at schools, synagogues, churches. Their memories were not delivered with bitterness, but with a plea. Remember what people can become when they forget their conscience. One survivor, when asked why he continued to tell his story though it pained him, answered, "Because silence is where it all began." In 1963, another milestone, the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials. Here, 22 former SS officers and staff, members of the camp, faced justice in a German court. The trial lasted nearly 2 years. Witnesses came from across the world. They pointed across the courtroom at men who had once commanded them. The testimony was harrowing, but for Germany, it was necessary. It was the first time ordinary citizens confronted what had happened not in some distant place, but in the name of their nation. One witness, a woman who had been a nurse before the war, described arriving at Auschwitz in 1943. Her voice trembled. "They took my mother first. I tried to follow her, but a soldier stopped me. I never saw her again. For years I thought I was the only one, but now I know there were thousands like me." When the verdicts were read, some sentences were light, some severe, a few acquitted, yet the symbolic weight was immense. Germany had looked into its own reflection and chosen not to turn away. From these trials emerged a new kind of memory, not of revenge, but of record. The testimonies, carefully transcribed, became archives, museums, films. They traveled through classrooms and generations. Each story, though deeply personal, became part of humanity's collective conscience. Outside Europe, the ripple continued. The United Nations passed conventions on genocide and human rights inspired directly by the Holocaust's revelations. International law had been changed forever. The moral idea that I was only following orders would never again be enough. Yet even as law advanced, denial crept in. Conspiracy theories and revisionist histories began to appear first in whispers, then in pamphlets. Some claimed the gas chambers were exaggerations, others that the numbers were inflated. Survivors, already elderly, found themselves defending their own suffering against those who sought to erase it. But they refused to yield. They spoke louder, recorded their stories, built institutions to protect the truth. By the 1982, Holocaust museums began to rise around the world. Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, later the memorials in Berlin, Paris, and countless cities beyond. Each one served as both courtroom and classroom. The evidence remained photographs, objects, voices, so that no denial could ever take root again without resistance. Through it all, the survivors carried on. They grew old, their tattoos fading into wrinkles, but their voices stayed strong. Some forgave, others could not. All remembered. They became the conscience of a century. And yet, their message was not only about the past. In each testimony, there was also a warning that evil begins not in gas chambers, but in words, in small exclusions, in the quiet turning away of neighbors. The trials had shown that civilization itself is fragile, that laws mean little when empathy disappears. As the decades passed, the world continued to listen. Filmmakers documented every detail, historians compiled names, teachers told children who had never known war what had happened on those tracks in southern Poland. Each telling renewed the promise that truth would outlast hate. Now, as the last witnesses fade from the earth, their testimonies remain recorded in ink and film, digitized for future generations. They speak not in anger, but in remembrance. Their words are lanterns held against the long shadow of denial. The trials gave form to justice. The testimonies gave it a soul. Together, they built the bridge between the incomprehensible and the understood, between the silence of Auschwitz and the voices that refused to let it die. And so, in the long aftermath of that dark century, the story continues. Not in courtrooms anymore, but in classrooms, museums, and in the hearts of those who still listen. For as long as a single voice of truth is heard, the trials of Auschwitz never truly end. The architecture of memory, long after the final guards had fled, after the last chimney cooled and the snow covered the tracks, Auschwitz did not disappear. It lingered in dreams, in silence, in the minds of those who had seen it and those who never would. The place itself stood broken, but not dead. Wooden barracks leaned with time. The barbed wire rusted. The watchtowers stared into emptiness. It had been a site of annihilation, but in the strange way history moves, it became something else. A place of remembrance, of conscience, of warning. When the war ended, no one knew quite what to do with Auschwitz. The Soviets had liberated it, but the camp lay in Polish territory, scarred and haunted. Some believed it should be left to decay, allowed to sink back into the soil as if to bury the shame forever. Others insisted it must be preserved, not as a museum, but as evidence, an unhealed wound that should never be allowed to close. The debate itself reflected the world's confusion. How do you memorialize a place built for forgetting? How do you preserve horror without sanctifying it? In 1947, the decision was made. Auschwitz would remain. The Polish government, working with Jewish organizations and survivors, established the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum. It was one of the first Holocaust memorials on Earth. The goal was simple but sacred, to ensure that what happened there could never be denied, never be softened, never be erased. The early years were difficult. The site was vast, more than 150 buildings and over 400 acres of land. The crematoria lay in ruins, destroyed by the fleeing SS in their last days. Grass began to grow over the rubble. Survivors who returned to help curate the museum found it unbearable to walk the same roads, to enter the same barracks. Many wept. Others worked in silence. They knew that what they were preserving was not just brick and wood, but the memory of millions who had no graves. In the exhibitions, the personal returned. Behind glass lay piles of shoes, mountains of spectacles, suitcases with names carefully written in white paint. There were strands of hair, still braided, children's clothing folded neatly, never worn again. Visitors walked through these rooms in stunned quiet. Each object, mundane in life, had become sacred in death. A shoe was no longer leather and thread, it was a heartbeat, a story, a life cut short. Outside, the landscape of Birkenau stretched endlessly. The railway track, splitting at the ramp, still led into the camp. Visitors walked beneath the gatehouse with its red brick arch and watched the horizon vanish into fog. Along the path, the ruins of gas chambers lay open to the sky, their concrete walls fractured but still whispering. Birds perched on the remnants of chimneys that once belched smoke. Even in silence, the place seemed to breathe. Survivors who visited often struggled to speak. For them, Auschwitz was not history, it was memory incarnate. Some brought their children and grandchildren, guiding them through the grounds, telling them what each corner once meant. Here, one might say softly, is where I stood. Others stayed away forever. They said their memories did not need a monument, they carried it inside them. As the decades passed, Auschwitz became more than a museum. It became a pilgrimage. People came from every continent, students, priests, presidents, rabbis, and ordinary travelers. They arrived not for spectacle, but for silence. School children walked hand in hand along the tracks. Elderly visitors laid flowers before the execution wall. In 1979, UNESCO declared it a World Heritage Site, not for beauty, but for its moral gravity. The world had agreed this place belonged to all of humanity. But with recognition came new questions. How should such a place be shown? Could any display ever convey its horror truthfully? Should the exhibits be graphic or restrained? Should guides explain? Or should silence speak? The curators faced impossible choices. To restore too much would risk falsifying reality. To let decay run its course would risk forgetting. They chose a middle path, preservation without embellishment. The barracks would remain as they were. The ruins would stay untouched. Time itself would become part of the memorial. The site's caretakers faced a constant struggle against erosion not just of the buildings, but of memory itself. The wooden barracks warped in rain, iron rusted, photographs faded. The museum established conservation labs to preserve every artifact. Scientists treated leather and cloth, strengthened foundations, stabilized ashes so they would not blow away. In 2009, the Auschwitz-Birkenau Foundation was created to secure the future of the site. Countries from around the world, Germany, Israel, the United States, France, and dozens more contributed millions. The burden of remembrance had become a shared human duty. As time carried the survivors toward the end of their lives, another challenge emerged: how to preserve their voices. The generation that had lived the camps was fading. Their testimonies, once given in classrooms and courtrooms, were now recorded on film, in archives, in digital databases. The Shoah Foundation gathered over 50,000 interviews, hours of memories, faces, voices trembling but strong. It was an archive of emotion as much as evidence. For those who would one day listen, these testimonies would be the final direct connection to the truth. But memory, like architecture, changes with time. For the survivors, Auschwitz was a scar. For their children, it became inheritance. And for the generations born after, it became history, something to be learned, interpreted, sometimes misunderstood. In each country, the meaning shifted. For Jews, it was the heart of the Holocaust. For Poles, it was also a site of national martyrdom, where political prisoners and resistance members perished. For Roma families, it was a place of near total annihilation. For the world at large, it became a symbol of what happens when humanity forgets its own humanity. As decades passed, new memorials began to echo Auschwitz's message. In Berlin, The memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe stretched across a city block, endless slabs of concrete, rising and falling like waves of silence. In Paris, a subterranean chamber honored the deported, with names carved into stone. In Washington, the U.S., Holocaust Memorial Museum opened in 1993, inviting millions to walk through recreated cattle cars, barracks, and testimonies. Each of these places drew their design not from grandeur, but from restraint. Their architecture whispered rather than shouted. They sought not to impress, but to confront. This was the architecture of memory, not built of marble and triumph, but of absence and echo. Its foundations were grief, its pillars silence, its walls the air between a question and its answer. It asked nothing of the visitor except honesty to stand, to see, to feel. Even as memorials grew, time continued to erode the connection between the living and the event. By the turn of the 21st century, many young people knew Auschwitz only as a word in a textbook, an image in a film, a line in history class. Surveys revealed that knowledge was fading. In some countries, fewer than half could identify what Auschwitz was. The survivors' warnings that forgetting is the first step toward repetition began to sound more urgent. In response, technology stepped forward as memory's new ally. Museums introduced digital archives and virtual reality tours. Visitors could now explore the camp remotely, guided by recorded voices of survivors. Artificial intelligence allowed future generations to ask questions of virtual witnesses' recreations built from thousands of hours of interviews. The goal was not spectacle, but continuity, to keep the dialogue alive after the last human witness had gone. And yet, with every innovation, came a risk. Could the experience of horror ever be transmitted through screens? Could empathy survive translation into pixels? The curators of Auschwitz insisted on restraint. No simulation, they said, could replace the quiet weight of standing where the ashes fell. The site itself must remain the anchor, a place where memory touches earth. Auschwitz today receives millions of visitors each year. They arrive from every corner of the globe, walking slowly beneath the iron gate whose words still read, "Our bite-mocked frei work sets you free." They enter the barracks, the exhibits, the fields. Many weep. Others stand still for long minutes, trying to find words that do not exist. In their silence, the memory continues to live. Each January 27th, on the anniversary of liberation, candles are lit across the world. Survivors gather in the cold, joined by their children and grandchildren. They speak the names of those who never returned. Some hold faded photographs, others hold nothing but the air. As darkness falls, the camp glows with thousands of tiny flames. For a moment, it feels less like a cemetery and more like a vigil kept by all of humanity. The architecture of memory is not built once. It must be rebuilt each generation in schools, in art, in conscience. The stones of Auschwitz remind, but it is human attention that keeps them alive. Each visitor, each student, each listener becomes a new foundation in that ongoing construction. The museum's motto, quietly inscribed near its entrance, reads, "Forever let this place be a cry of despair and a warning to humanity." A cry and a warning that is all that remains, and perhaps all that is needed. Because the true architecture of memory is not made of stone at all. It lives in the act of remembering, in a teacher's lesson, in a whispered prayer, in a child who asks, "Why did this happen?" and in the parent who answers with honesty. It lives wherever truth is defended from distortion, wherever compassion survives cynicism, wherever silence is filled, not with denial, but with reflection. The barbed wire still rusts beneath the Polish sky. The wind moves through the birch trees that gave Birkenau its name, and if you stand there long enough, in the quiet between footsteps, you may feel it, the heartbeat of remembrance, still steady after all these years. Auschwitz, once designed to erase, has become humanity's most enduring memory. It stands not only as proof of what was, but as a mirror for what could be. Its bricks hold not the voices of the dead, but the promise of the living that as long as memory is kept, cruelty can never again be disguised as order. From ashes to education. When the fires of Auschwitz were finally extinguished, when the last smoke dissolved into the sky and the ashes drifted into the soil, the question that lingered was not only how this could have happened, but how it should be remembered. Liberation had freed the bodies, but not the conscience of humanity. The ruins of the camp remained, mute and immovable, while the world around them rebuilt, eager to move forward. Yet beneath the reconstruction lay a silence that was heavier than rubble, the silence of memory still unspoken. In the early years after the war, the Holocaust was not taught, it was endured. Survivors lived among the ruins of Europe, many too haunted to speak, too uncertain of who would listen. Nations too were not ready. Germany, divided and ashamed, turned its eyes toward rebuilding. In Eastern Europe, new communist regimes reshaped history into lessons of anti-fascist struggle, flattening the uniquely Jewish dimension of the genocide. In the West, people preferred words like tragedy and atrocity, but few could yet say Holocaust. The language for such horror had not yet been invented, but memory, like a buried seed, began to stir. It started not in classrooms or governments, but in living rooms and letters. Survivors, often quietly, began to write. Some kept diaries, others dictated their stories to family members who urged them to record what they had seen. In the 1,950 seconds, a few of these testimonies reached the world. Primo Levi's "If This Is a Man," Elie Wiesel's "Night," Viktor Frankl's "Man's Search for Meaning." These were not histories. They were testaments, personal, human, filled with the pain and dignity of those who had endured the unendurable. Their voices carried what textbooks could not: the texture of hunger, the smell of the barracks, the weight of a lost name. For many survivors, speaking was not only remembrance, it was survival. They felt an obligation to the dead to give their silence a sound. Yet, there was also shame and fear of disbelief. How do you explain a world that had been reduced to ashes and numbers? Some tried once, saw disbelief in the listener's eyes, and never spoke again. Others waited decades, until their hair turned white, before they could find words at all. Still, history was beginning to shift. In Israel, the newly founded state made remembrance a duty of nationhood. Yom HaShoah Holocaust, Remembrance Day, was established. Every year, sirens wailed across the country, freezing traffic and speech. People stood still in streets, schools, and markets, heads bowed as the sound carried through the hills. It was not mourning alone, but defiance, a reminder that from the ashes, a people still lived. In Europe, museums and memorials grew slowly, cautiously. In Germany, Auschwitz became compulsory study for students. It was the first step in turning memory into education. By the 1,960 seconds, the world's conscience had begun to awaken. The televised trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem forced millions to confront what they had only read about in passing. Ordinary viewers watched survivors testify about the ghettos, the transports, the selections, the gas chambers. Their trembling voices made history real again, not in theory, but in flesh. Eichmann obeyed orders, he said, but the world saw obedience for what it was: complicity dressed as duty. That trial became a classroom for the planet, a moral education for an age that still sought excuses for cruelty. Schools began to follow. In Germany, Holocaust education became mandatory. Students were taken to former camps to face their country's past directly. Teachers struggled to find balance. How much horror can a child bear without losing hope? How do you teach evil without overwhelming innocence? Some chose to show the evidence in stark detail. Others emphasized empathy, stories of courage, of small acts of kindness in the dark. There was no single way to teach it, only the shared conviction that forgetting was the first step toward repetition. In the United States, Holocaust studies entered classrooms more gradually. It began with literature. Anne Frank's diary. Films like The Diary of Anne Frank and Judgment at Nuremberg. Teachers discovered that storytelling reached hearts where statistics could not. By the 1,980 seconds, Holocaust education had become a permanent part of school curricula, often taught not as history alone, but as ethics, a mirror for moral choice. Students were asked not only what happened, but how people let it happen. They read testimonies, watched documentaries, and sometimes met survivors in person. Those encounters were transformative. Many survivors became teachers, standing in classrooms instead of courtrooms, telling their stories to the young with trembling hands and steady eyes. Their lessons were not about hate, but humanity. In 1993, the opening of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., changed the landscape of remembrance. It was not a monument to the dead, but a living space for the living. Visitors walked through dark halls lined with photographs and shoes, through train cars and barracks, through whispers of names. They emerged into light, a symbolic journey from ignorance to awareness. The museum did not tell people what to feel. It let them discover the weight of memory for themselves. For many, it was their first real education in Evil One that left them quieter, humbler, more vigilant. Around the same time, other nations built their own centers of learning. In Jerusalem, Yad Vashem expanded into one of the world's most comprehensive archives of Holocaust testimony. Its corridors held not relics, but voices. Its walls bore names that once had been erased. And outside, in the avenue of the righteous among the nations, trees grew, each one planted for someone who had risked everything to save a stranger. From ashes, forests rose. Education took on new forms as the world changed. Teachers traveled with students to Poland, walking the same tracks that once carried trains of death. These pilgrimages, March of the Living they were called, were not about guilt but understanding. Young people stood on the frozen ground of Birkenau, candles in hand, listening to survivors who pointed at the ruins and said softly, "This is where it happened." For many of those students, that moment became the most important lesson of their lives. But as the survivors aged, the challenge deepened. Their voices grew faint, their numbers dwindled. Historians, filmmakers, and archivists raced to capture what time would soon erase. They recorded thousands of hours of interviews, each story a fragment of the whole. Later came new technologies, holographic witnesses who could answer questions through artificial intelligence, digital archives accessible to anyone with a screen. For a generation raised in pixels, memory had to adapt. The goal was not to replace presence, but to preserve its echo, to let the next century still hear the trembling breath of truth. In classrooms today, teaching Auschwitz is no longer only about the past. It is about patterns. Students learn how propaganda works, how prejudice grows, how bureaucracy can turn cruelty into procedure. They learn that genocide begins not with gas, but with words, with ridicule, exclusion, silence. Teachers explain that the Holocaust was not inevitable. It was built, step by step, by choices unopposed. The purpose of such lessons is not to frighten, but to awaken. For survivors' children, the second-generation education became inheritance. They carried not the tattooed numbers, but the invisible ones. They spoke in their parents' place, wrote memoirs, founded organizations, became historians and poets. Through them, remembrance turned into vocation. They taught that memory must not only preserve suffering, but transform it into empathy, into vigilance for others. Because to truly learn from Auschwitz is not to memorize its facts, but to recognize its beginnings whenever they appear in any corner of the world. Holocaust education reached beyond Europe. In Rwanda, in Cambodia, in Bosnia, in Darfur, scholars and human rights activists studied the mechanisms of Auschwitz to understand their own tragedies. It became not only a lesson in Jewish history, but in human failure. The phrase, "never again," traveled beyond its origin, whispered in new languages, applied to new horrors. It became both prayer and warning, fragile but enduring. Still, remembrance has its enemies. In some corners of the world, denial has crept back, cloaked in politics and distortion. There are those who call the evidence exaggerated, who twist history to serve ideology. Others use Auschwitz as a metaphor so loosely that it loses its meaning. Against this tide, educators stand as the new guards of truth. They hold classes, publish resources, and train teachers to face misinformation with facts, empathy, and patience. Every lesson taught is an act of defiance, not against ignorance, but against indifference. In this way, education has become the second life of Auschwitz. From the ashes of the camp rose a classroom for the world. Each testimony, each book, each discussion is a beam in that unseen structure. Its purpose is not to punish, but to protect, not to dwell on death, but to affirm life, the fragile, precious kind that once was denied. When children today read Anne Frank's diary, they do not only meet a girl hiding from soldiers, they meet courage in its smallest, most human form. When they hear the trembling voice of a survivor describing liberation, they feel the pulse of endurance. When they see a photograph of the gate at Auschwitz, they learn not to look away from pain, but to face it and learn. Education, at its truest, is remembrance made active, knowledge shaped into conscience. Every January 27th, classrooms across the world pause to remember. Teachers dim the lights. Names are read aloud. For a few minutes, time stops, and history becomes present again. Some children close their eyes. Others hold candles. And though they were born in a different century, they inherit the same duty to remember what happens when hatred becomes law, when silence becomes approval, when people forget the worth of a single life. That is the lesson the survivors gave to the world. Their voices may fade, but their teaching continues through every student who learns, every teacher who tells, every parent who explains. The ashes of Auschwitz are now part of our collective soil. From them, the fragile shoots of understanding still grow. To teach is to remember is to resist forgetting, and as long as there are those willing to learn, the gates of Auschwitz, once symbols of deception, will stand instead as symbols of warning, illuminated by the light of truth passed from one generation to the next. Legacy, and the warning. The gates of Auschwitz stand open now. The barbed wire no longer hums with current. The watchtowers no longer watch. The chimneys, once thick with smoke, rise like silent fingers against the sky. Yet, even in stillness, the place speaks. It speaks not of the past alone, but of the uneasy bond between memory and forgetting, and the price humanity pays when it forgets. For those who walk there today, it is hard to imagine how it once felt alive with death. The wind moves through the ruins softly now, brushing over the rusted tracks where trains once screeched to a halt. Tourists whisper. Students listen. Guides speak in reverent tones. But beneath every footstep lies a weight that words cannot fully hold. Auschwitz is no longer an active place, yet it remains a living thing, breathing through remembrance, warning through silence. The war ended generations ago. The survivors have grown old, their voices dimming with time, but the story they carried refuses to vanish. It echoes in classrooms, in museums, in ceremonies, in the gentle cadence of names read aloud each January 27th. It lingers because it must, for without it, the world's moral compass drifts once more toward darkness. Auschwitz was never just a camp, it was the mirror in which humanity saw its own reflection and recoiled. It showed how ordinary men and women, given authority, ideology, and indifference, could construct hell brick by brick. It proved that evil is not born of monsters, but of people who stop questioning, who stop feeling, who find comfort in obedience. And that is why its legacy is not confined to history. It belongs to the present, to every generation that believes itself immune. After the war, the world tried to find meaning in what seemed beyond meaning. From the ashes of Auschwitz arose new laws, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Genocide Convention, the modern language of human dignity and accountability. The phrase crimes against humanity entered the legal lexicon. Nations swore never again. But words, however noble, are fragile things. Their strength lies not in their writing, but in their remembrance. As the decades passed, the legacy of Auschwitz became layered: part history, part morality, part warning. For survivors, it was a scar that could not heal. For scholars, it was a study of power and psychology. For politicians, it was often a symbol invoked, sometimes too lightly, to justify or condemn. But for humanity, in its truest form, it remained something deeper, a moral landmark that asks not what happened, but how it happened, and whether it could again. For evil does not erupt like a storm. It begins quietly in jokes, in whispers, in the slow corrosion of empathy. It grows when the suffering of others becomes background noise. It thrives when people choose comfort over conscience. The road to Auschwitz was paved not with sudden hatred, but with gradual permission, the permission to see others as less than human. That is the lesson its ruins still whisper through the wind, that every atrocity begins with the loss of empathy. Walk through the museum and you will see it. The suitcases, neatly labeled with names, the eyeglasses, the shoes, the hair. They were not symbols of death when they were taken. They were possessions of life. A mother's pair of heels, a boy's school satchel, a child's toy horse. Each one belonged to someone who believed they were going on a journey, not toward death, but toward resettlement, work, survival. The lie was efficient because it was small. That, too, is part of the warning. The survivors who lived to tell their stories did more than bear witness. They gave the world its conscience back. They spoke in courtrooms, schools, churches. They stood trembling before audiences who had never seen a camp and said, "I was there." They held up their tattooed arms as evidence when words were not enough. Their message was simple. What happened once can happen again if we allow it. And their faith in the power of remembrance was perhaps the greatest act of hope to come out of so much despair. Yet time is relentless. Each year, fewer voices remain. Soon, the world will have no living witnesses, only recordings, letters, and ruins. And the danger grows that remembrance will fade into ritual, that never again will become a phrase recited, not a promise lived. The legacy of Auschwitz depends not on stone or statute, but on attention, on the willingness to look, to listen, to feel discomfort. Memory, like freedom, must be defended. In recent years, that defense has become more urgent. In some corners of the world, denial has re-emerged, disguised as skepticism. Others, weary of guilt, call for moving on, for leaving the past in the past. But the past does not rest quietly. It breathes beneath the surface of every prejudice, every dehumanizing law, every voice that says, "They are not like us." Auschwitz reminds us where such words lead when they go unanswered. It also teaches something profound about resilience. For even in that place of engineered death, there were sparks of life. Prisoners shared crusts of bread, whispered prayers, hummed lullabies in the dark. A mother smuggled her child into a line for labor, saving her life. A doctor risked execution to write the names of the murdered on scraps of paper so they would not vanish. These acts, small and unseen, became threads of humanity woven into the black fabric of despair. They are proof that even in the machinery of cruelty, goodness can survive, if only in fragments. That, too, is the legacy. That light can exist even in absolute darkness. That memory itself is a form of resistance. In the decades after the war, Auschwitz became a pilgrimage not of faith, but of conscience. Popes, presidents, rabbis, survivors, and ordinary visitors walked through its gates. Some prayed, some wept, some said nothing at all. But all felt the same weight that this ground had absorbed not just death, but responsibility. In its quiet, one could feel the echo of millions who could no longer speak. And in that silence, understanding often came more clearly than through words. Artists, poets, and filmmakers carried that legacy further. They painted, wrote, and filmed not to shock, but to remember. Claude Lanzmann's Shoah let survivors and perpetrators speak side by side. Elie Wiesel's Night whispered from the page like scripture rewritten in grief. Steven Spielberg's Schindler's List showed the grayness of morality amid black and white horror. Each work extended the life of memory, turning art into education and education into empathy. But memory's survival is not guaranteed. As generations pass, distance grows. To a child born today, the Holocaust is as far away as medieval history. That is the test of our age, whether we can keep remembrance alive without the living, whether the ruins of Auschwitz will still speak when the last eyewitness has gone, whether the phrase "never again" will still carry meaning when spoken by those who never felt its absence. The answer lies not in monuments, but in minds. The legacy of Auschwitz will endure only if it is taught not as tragedy alone, but as warning. It is not a story of the past, but a pattern, one that begins whenever fear replaces compassion, whenever identity becomes a weapon, whenever indifference outweighs outrage. To teach that is to guard against repetition. Today, as nationalism rises again in many corners of the world, as refugees are turned away from borders, as words of division echo through politics and screens, the lesson of Auschwitz feels no less urgent. Hatred has new languages now, digital, subtle, viral, but its roots remain the same. The danger is not that people will forget the Holocaust happened. The danger is that they will stop believing something like it could happen again. That is why the warning matters. It is not a ghost story. It is a mirror held up to humanity's face, showing both its darkness and its capacity to overcome it. The survivors, in their final years, understood this. When asked what they wanted young people to learn, most did not speak of the past. They spoke of the present. "Do not hate," they said. "Do not be silent. Do not think it cannot happen where you are." The weight of their words rests now on us. Memory, after all, is inheritance. We did not live it, but we live with its consequences. The world that emerged from the ashes with its laws, its human rights, its international courts, exists because Auschwitz existed. If we let its meaning fade, we risk undoing the moral architecture built from its ruins. Walk one last time through the camp, and you see it clearly. The rails end at the platform, disappearing into grass. The chimneys lean, broken. The wind moves gently through the wire, carrying no screams, now only whispers. And yet, the air feels alive with something sacred. Not religion, not ceremony, but memory itself, fragile, human, undying. That is the legacy. Not only what was lost, but what was learned. That every generation must rebuild its conscience from the ruins of the last. That remembrance is not sorrow, but duty. That silence, when it comes to evil, is complicity, and that even among ashes, there can still be light. Auschwitz was a place of endings, but its memory is a beginning, a bridge between horror and hope, between the worst we were and the best we might still become. It teaches that history, though cruel, can also redeem if we listen, if we learn, if we never again allow the machinery of hate to turn unchecked. The gates remain open now, not to let people in, but to let understanding out. And beyond them, in every corner of the world, in every classroom and heart, the warning still travels quiet but insistent. Do not look away. Do not forget. Do not let the comfort of distance erase the cost of indifference. For the moment we stop remembering, the past stops being past, and that, above all, is what Auschwitz still teaches. Epilogue: the world after Auschwitz. When the gates of Auschwitz swung open in January 1945, the world did not simply confront a camp, it confronted itself. The liberation revealed not just corpses and ashes, but a mirror. And in that mirror, humanity saw its reflection dimmed by indifference, obedience, and fear. What followed was not a celebration of victory, but a reckoning that still has no end. In the years after the war, nations buried their dead, rebuilt their cities, and tried to heal their pride. But beneath the noise of reconstruction lay a quiet undercurrent of guilt and wonder. A question that haunted survivors and soldiers alike. What now? How does one live after witnessing a world built to extinguish life? How does one build again, knowing what people are capable of? The survivors carried that question across continents. They settled in America, in Israel, in Australia, in Canada. They built shops, raised families, laughed again when they could. Yet every ordinary moment, a child's birthday, a quiet dinner, a song on the radio carried an invisible shadow. For many, the world after Auschwitz was a place they could live in but never fully belonged to. They looked at the faces of those who had not seen the camps, kind, curious faces, and felt both gratitude and distance, gratitude that others could still live without such memories. Distance because they themselves never could. Even decades later, a train whistle or the sound of boots on gravel could summon ghosts that no therapy could quiet. But life, somehow, continued. And through that continuation came meaning. Survivors did not only rebuild their own lives, they rebuilt the conscience of humanity. They testified in trials, recorded memories, founded organizations. They built museums, wrote books, raised awareness, not because they wished to be heroes, but because they could not bear the thought that silence might return. They became the world's teachers, not of history, but of responsibility. Each time they stood before a classroom, lifted a sleeve, and revealed the tattooed numbers on their arm, they turned horror into warning. The birth of a new conscience, Auschwitz, reshaped the world's moral vocabulary. It gave birth to words that had never before existed in law or language: genocide, crimes against humanity, the final solution, human rights. At Nuremberg, for the first time, the victors declared that following orders was not a defense. That morality could not be suspended by uniform or duty. That obedience, when divorced from conscience, was itself a crime. In 1948, the United Nations adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a document built upon the ashes of the camps. Its authors had walked through the ruins. They had seen what happens when a government is allowed to define who counts as human. The Declaration became humanity's pledge, fragile, imperfect, but essential, that dignity belongs to everyone, everywhere. That same year, the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide was adopted. Its purpose was clear: to give the world the power to name and confront the unspeakable before it began again. The man who coined the term genocide, Raphael Lemkin, was himself a Polish Jew who had lost most of his family in the Holocaust. For him, the law was not theory. It was memory turned into action, and yet history proved that laws alone were not enough. The decades that followed, from Cambodia to Rwanda, from Bosnia to Darfur, showed that the world still struggled to hear its own warning. Never again, though spoken with conviction, too often meant not yet. Still, without Auschwitz, there would be no such phrase at all. Its memory became a compass, a guidepost for generations who might otherwise lose their way. The survivor's gift. As the 20th century aged, the survivors aged with it. They became grandparents, then great-grandparents, carrying in their fragile hands the last living link to a history the world could scarcely bear to remember. Some spoke in schools, others in synagogues, some only to their children. Their voices trembled, not with weakness, but with the weight of what they carried. They told stories of kindness that had flickered in the darkness, a fellow prisoner sharing bread, a guard who looked away just once, a nurse who whispered a prayer. They spoke of loss without bitterness, of faith tested but not broken. They did not seek pity, they sought understanding. Their testimony changed how nations remembered. In Germany, young people listened to survivors as if to their own grandparents, with tears, with shame, with resolve. In America, they filled auditoriums, turning pain into lesson. In Israel, they marched beside their descendants through Auschwitz itself, holding torches where once there had been only shadows. Through them, remembrance became not only an act of mourning, but of transformation, a world still learning. The generations born after the war inherited both comfort and burden. They grew up in a world shaped by the Holocaust, but often disconnected from its immediacy. For them, Auschwitz was history, a place to visit, a subject to study, a symbol too vast to fully grasp. And yet, through films, books, museums, and memorials, they learned that the Holocaust was not only about numbers, but about faces. that every photograph in those exhibits, every family smiling before the storm, was a story interrupted. They learned that the Holocaust did not begin with camps, but with words, laws, propaganda, silence. As decades passed, a strange paradox emerged. The more distant the event became, the more universal its meaning grew. Auschwitz came to stand not only for Jewish suffering, but for every act of systematic dehumanization. It became a warning to all who might be marginalized, scapegoated, or erased. It reminded the powerful of restraint and the powerless of resilience. In classrooms from Tokyo to Toronto, children learned its story as part of humanity's shared inheritance. They were taught not just to remember, but to recognize, to see the signs when prejudice blooms again. The fragile flame time, however, is relentless. The survivors are nearly gone now. Their voices live on in recordings, their faces in documentaries, their words in archives. Technology has extended memory's life, but it cannot replace presence. A hologram may answer questions, but it cannot weep. A recording can replay a voice, but it cannot tremble. The true danger now is not forgetting, but dilution, the transformation of horror into cliché, of remembrance into ritual. Every generation faces the temptation to simplify what should never be simplified, to turn Auschwitz into a metaphor, a museum, a moral slogan, rather than the concrete and terrifying reality it was. That is why education remains sacred. Each time a teacher explains what happened, each time a student asks why, the chain remains unbroken. Memory survives not through ceremony, but through curiosity, through the willingness to look closely, even when it hurts. And so, the work continues. The torch passes from survivors to scholars, from scholars to teachers, from teachers to children. Each hand that carries it keeps the light alive, faint, but enough to guide us through the fog of forgetting. The moral echo. Auschwitz left more than ruins behind. It left a moral echo that reverberates through modern life. It echoes in the refugee seeking safety, in the journalist exposing lies, in the judge defending law from tyranny. It echoes in the quiet protester who stands alone with a sign, refusing to look away. The lessons of the camp reach beyond its fences. They whisper that democracy is not a gift, but a task. That decency must be chosen, not assumed. That indifference, more than hatred, is the enemy of civilization. When the Holocaust ended, people said it could never happen again. And yet, each generation witnesses new atrocities, new victims, new silences. The world after Auschwitz is still learning to listen to its own warning. Perhaps that is the camp's final paradox, that even in death, it demands life. It demands moral attention. It demands conscience. The eternal watchtower. If you stand at Auschwitz at dusk, when the last visitors have gone and the wind settles into the birch trees, the place feels almost timeless. The light fades slowly over the watchtowers, and the horizon blurs into mist. The silence is vast, the kind that humbles speech. Somewhere, a single bird calls. Somewhere, a gate creaks in the wind. And in that silence, you understand that Auschwitz has become the world's eternal watchtower, standing guard, not over prisoners, but over memory itself. Its message is not shouted, it is whispered. It says, "This is what happens when truth is replaced by ideology. When people trade compassion for conformity, when fear becomes a virtue, and apathy a refuge." Every generation must hear that whisper anew. Every generation must decide whether to listen. The promise, the world after Auschwitz is not free from darkness, but it is more aware of its own shadow. Every act of kindness, every defense of truth, every effort to protect the vulnerable, carries within it the faint reflection of that promise, never again. The phrase is not an incantation, it is a responsibility. It means, not again here, not again anywhere, not again to anyone. The survivors asked for nothing more than that, not vengeance, not glory, only remembrance. They wanted the world to remember what happens when humanity forgets itself. They wanted their children, and their children's children, to live in a world where identity could never again determine worth. That remains the unfinished work of our age. To keep that promise, to guard that flame. Because the world after Auschwitz is not defined by what was destroyed, but by what remains. The stubborn capacity for goodness, for empathy, for renewal, the last light. One day soon, the last survivor will close their eyes, and the last direct voice will fall silent. When that day comes, the duty will belong entirely to us, to remember, to teach, to care. And when the question is asked, why still speak of Auschwitz? The answer will be simple, because silence built it, and memory keeps it from returning. Auschwitz ended 80 years ago, but its echo still hums through the wires of history, a quiet warning carried on the wind. It asks the living to listen, to pay attention, to never again let the machinery of hate turn unchecked. The world after Auschwitz is the world we live in now, imperfect, fragile, yet still capable of compassion. It is a world where every act of remembrance is a rebellion against indifference, every story told a victory over forgetting. And as the candles burn low on the memorial grounds each January, their light spills beyond the fences, beyond the ruins, beyond time itself, joining the stars, the same stars that once looked down on a world in darkness. They remind us that even when humanity fails, it can rise again. That memory, like light, never truly dies. It only waits for someone to keep it burning.